The salon smells the way salons always smell. Warm air and acetone, something floral underneath that, and beneath all of that something sharper, something almost medicinal, though no one has ever stopped to name it. It is a Tuesday in 2008. Outside, the weather is doing what it always does in November, misting without committing to actual rain, and inside the windows have fogged slightly from the heat of the blow dryers. There are 4 of them going at once, and the sound they make is the sound of white noise at its most domestic, a steady mechanical roar that could put you to sleep if you let it. You're in the chair nearest the window. Your hair is wrapped in a thin plastic cap, and a woman named Maria is applying something to it with a brush, working in sections, her movements practiced and unhurried. The product smells like nothing you can identify, or rather, it smells like the absence of something. A clean, flat chemical note that your brain registers as artificial and then quietly files away. You were told it would make your hair smoother, that it would last 3 months, maybe 4, that it was the treatment every celebrity was using. You were told a lot of things. The chair is comfortable. The music playing overhead is something slow and unmemorable, a soft acoustic cover of a song you half recognize. Maria's hands are warm through the latex gloves she wears. She tells you this is going to change your life. She has said this to every client today. She believes it every time. This is a story about what was in the bottle she was using, about who knew and when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. It is also a story about the women who sat in chairs like this one, in salons from Portland to Miami, from 2005 to well past the point when someone should have said stop. It is a quiet story. It does not involve villains in the traditional sense. It involves something more ordinary and in some ways more troubling. The slow accumulation of decisions made by people who found it easier not to look too closely at what they were selling. Settle in. There is no hurry here. The blow dryers are still going. Maria is still working. The afternoon light through the fogged window is turning golden, and the chemical note in the air is something you've already stopped noticing. That is, in its way, the most important part of the story. The things we stop noticing, the things we learn to call normal. In 2011, the Food and Drug Administration sent a formal warning letter to the company that made Brazilian Blowout professional smoothing solution. The letter stated that the product was misbranded. Among other things, it said formaldehyde-free on the label. The FDA found formaldehyde in it at concentrations that, when released during the heat application phase of the treatment, produced air levels more than 10 times the occupational safety limit. 10 times! Not a rounding error, not a borderline case. 10 times the concentration that OSHA says no worker should breathe. Between 2005 and 2011, millions of women sat in chairs like yours. Tens of thousands of women like Maria applied the treatment day after day in salons with no particular reason to doubt what the label said. They breathed the air that the flat iron produced. They went home with headaches they attributed to long days. They developed coughs they attributed to the season. Some of them developed respiratory symptoms that did not go away when the season changed. The afternoon is quiet now. The product is doing its work and Maria is moving to the next section, and the blow dryer covers everything in its soft, continuous sound. You can let your eyes close. This story will tell itself slowly, the way these stories always do. Not with alarm, not with anger, but with the particular calm of someone who has followed the thread all the way to its end, and found that knowing, even late, is still worth something. To understand what happened in those salons, it helps to understand what women were being sold before it happened. And to understand that, you have to go back a little further than 2005, back to the particular cultural weather that made a product like Brazilian Blowout not just possible, but, for a time, irresistible. Hair, in the early years of the 21st century, had become a serious subject. Not that it had ever been casual. Women have been negotiating with their hair since the beginning of recorded vanity, which is to say the beginning of recorded history. But something had shifted in the 1990s and continued shifting into the 2000s. The shift was this. Straight had become the default setting for professional, put-together adult womanhood. Not just preferred, default. The kind of straightness that required effort but was supposed to appear effortless. The kind that said I woke up like this while also clearly demonstrating that no one woke up like this. The straightening iron had been around for decades, but the modern ceramic flat iron arrived in earnest in the mid-1990s, and by 2000 it was everywhere. Salons offered professional blowouts, Beauty editors ran articles on the tools and techniques that produced that particular smooth, weightless cascade of hair associated with magazine covers and red carpets. Women who had never straightened their hair before began doing so, because straightened hair had become the visual shorthand for having one's life in order. There is something worth sitting with in that cultural moment, the specific way that hair became a proxy for competence, for seriousness, for the particular kind of put-together that women in professional environments were implicitly required to embody. Hair that curled in humidity was hair that could not be controlled. Hair that frizzed was hair that had given up. The beauty industry did not create this association entirely on its own. It was the beauty industry's particular skill to find the anxiety that already existed in the culture and offer to address it with a product. Brazilian straightening treatments began appearing in the United States in the early 2000s, originally from Brazil, where the treatment had been developed and had quickly become popular among women who wanted a longer-lasting alternative to daily flat ironing. The name stuck to the treatment even as it travelled, and it carried with it a slightly glamorous foreign provenance, something imported, something that the Hollywood stylists were said to use, something that arrived with the implicit endorsement of a beauty culture that takes hair seriously. The man who developed the original Brazilian straightening formula was named Luciano Meira. He worked in the cosmetics industry in São Paulo, had been experimenting with various approaches to smoothing and straightening treatments, and in the late 1990s developed a formulation using formaldehyde as the active crosslinking ingredient. The treatment worked well. It produced dramatic smoothing effects that lasted for months, and within a few years it had become one of the most popular salon services in Brazil. Formaldehyde's role in the treatment was not a secret within professional formulation chemistry. Formaldehyde is what is called a fixative or crosslinker, a chemical capable of forming permanent bonds between protein molecules, locking them into a new configuration. In the context of hair, this meant that the waving and curling structure of the hair's protein could be partially remade, with the flat iron providing the heat needed to drive the cross-linking reaction and seal the new configuration into place. The chemistry was elegant, in the way industrial chemistry sometimes is, a single compound doing several jobs at once, at low cost, with reliable results. That formaldehyde was a known carcinogen was not a new discovery when Brazilian treatments began arriving in American salons. The World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer had classified formaldehyde as a Group 1 known human carcinogen in 2004, a classification that represents the highest level of evidence for cancer causation. The evidence base included decades of research on workers in occupations with high formaldehyde exposure, embalmers who worked with formaldehyde-preserved bodies, anatomists who worked with formaldehyde-preserved specimens, workers in industries producing formaldehyde-based resins and adhesives. The evidence showed elevated rates of nasopharyngeal cancer and at higher exposure levels leukemia. This evidence was not obscure. It was in the major medical and occupational health journals. It was in the OSHA standards that had been established in 1992, specifically to limit formaldehyde exposure in American workplaces. It was in the material safety data sheets that chemical manufacturers were legally required to produce for any substance with occupational health implications. Formaldehyde was one of the most extensively studied industrial chemicals in the world, and what the study had found was not reassuring. The original Brazilian straightening treatment that arrived in American salons used this formaldehyde-based solution. This was known within the professional community from the beginning, or it should have been known. But the professional beauty community was not, in the early 2000s, a community with robust occupational health infrastructure. Cosmetologists received training in technique, in color chemistry, in client services. They did not typically receive extensive training in toxicology or in occupational exposure assessment. The products they used came with labels that were their primary source of information about what those products contained. A product that arrived in American salons labeled as a keratin treatment, keratin being the protein that hair is made of, a word that sounds natural and even wholesome, a word suggesting that you are essentially just restoring what hair is made of, did not prompt the kind of chemical scrutiny that a product labelled as a formaldehyde delivery system would have prompted. The vocabulary of the marketing was doing its work before any label claim was evaluated. The treatment spread through American salons with the speed that a genuinely effective and profitable service can travel in a market hungry for both. Stylists learned about it from other stylists, from trade shows, from the distributors who sold them the product and who had strong financial incentives to promote it. Salon owners saw the margins. The treatment could be priced at several $100s and took about 2 hours to administer, and recognized a profitable addition to their service menu. Clients heard about it from friends who had tried it and experienced the transformation firsthand. Word of mouth is the most powerful force in the beauty industry, and the word of mouth around Brazilian treatments was overwhelmingly positive because the results were real. Women with years of experience fighting with their own hair found that after a Brazilian treatment their hair behaved. It lay flat in humidity. It dried quickly after washing. The curls and waves that had required either elaborate management or a resigned acceptance of their own nature were gone, replaced by the smoothness that the culture had decided was the goal. This was not a small thing. For women whose hair had been a source of significant time investment, self-consciousness, or professional anxiety, the relief was genuine. The market for Brazilian treatments in the United States grew quickly. By 2008, they were available not just in high-end urban salons but in mid-range chains, in suburban salons, in beauty schools where students were being taught the technique as part of their professional training. The treatment spread from Manhattan to Missouri, from Los Angeles to Minneapolis, following the same distribution channels as every other salon product, the same distributors, the same trade shows, the same professional supply chains that moved colour and perm and shampoo from manufacturer to salon floor. The specific brand that would become the centre of the controversy was Brazilian Blowout Professional Smoothing Solution, distributed by GIB LLC of Los Angeles. It was not the only product in the category. Several other companies were selling similar treatments under different names, but it was the dominant brand in the American market, the one with the strongest distribution network and the most recognizable name. Brazilian Blowout, as a product and as a cultural reference, became the category name in the way that Kleenex became tissue. The product's label said during these years that it was formaldehyde-free. This claim had been chosen carefully. The marketing team at GIB LLC knew that formaldehyde was not a word that sounded good to the average consumer, and the formaldehyde-free claim was designed to preempt concern. It was also, as would become clear, false. But false in a technically complicated way that took regulatory agencies with air sampling equipment several years to fully document and act on. The technical complexity involved a compound called methylene glycol. In aqueous solution, in water, which is what haircare products are based on, formaldehyde exists in chemical equilibrium with its hydrated form, methylene glycol. The two compounds interconvert continuously in solution. When the product was tested in its bottle, some testing methodologies would detect methylene glycol rather than formaldehyde, and the company maintained that methylene glycol was not formaldehyde. The FDA eventually stated explicitly that for safety purposes, the distinction was meaningless. When heat was applied to the product during the flat iron phase of the treatment, the methylene glycol rapidly converted back to formaldehyde and was released as gas. This is the chemistry that the women in those salons were breathing, not methylene glycol, which sounds inert and technical and benign. Formaldehyde, the embalming fluid, the biology lab fixative, the Group 1 human carcinogen, in air concentrations that, as measurements would eventually show, exceeded OSHA's permissible exposure limits by factors ranging from 2 to more than 10. The flat irons ran all afternoon. The blow dryers provided their white noise. The salon smelled the way salons always smell. The windows stayed closed against the November chill, and the air inside held what the air inside always held, which was everything the day's work had put there. The distribution of smoothing treatments across the class spectrum of American salons tells its own quiet story about how chemical hazards travel. High-end salons typically had better ventilation. Their spaces were more expensively built, their clients more likely to ask questions, their owners more likely to belong to professional associations that communicated industry developments. The treatments reached mid-range and budget salons through the same supply chain, but in spaces with different physical characteristics and different institutional cultures around safety. A salon in a suburban strip mall built into a former retail space, converted with the minimum required to meet licensing standards, running its ventilation through the same HVAC system that heated and cooled the entire building, was a different physical environment than a purpose-built salon with dedicated ventilation for the treatment rooms. Both received the same product. Both received the same label. Both were equally relying on the label to tell them what the product contained. The economics of the treatment also created pressure in a specific direction. A $200 service could transform a slow Tuesday afternoon into a profitable one. A $500 service could change the financial profile of a week. For stylists working on commission, the Brazilian Blowout was among the highest earning services they could offer. This did not make them indifferent to safety. It made the safety claim on the label feel more important, not less. They needed to believe that the thing they were recommending to clients and spending hours administering was safe. The label confirmed it. The label was a relief. There is something both understandable and important about that dynamic. The way that financial interest and the desire to believe something safe can align, so that the label saying what you want it to say is not resisted but welcomed. The stylist who wanted to believe Brazilian Blowout was formaldehyde-free was not deluding herself out of greed. She was finding the available evidence, the label, sufficient because she had no reason to suspect the available evidence was wrong, and because having reason to suspect it would have complicated her professional life in uncomfortable ways. This psychological dynamic is well documented in the history of occupational chemical safety. Workers exposed to dangerous substances have consistently preferred the explanations that allowed them to continue working over the explanations that required them to stop. Not because they were irrational, but because the rational calculation includes livelihood and professional identity, and the ordinary human preference not to believe that one's daily work is injuring one's body. The label saying formaldehyde-free performed a function beyond its literal chemical claim. It said that the choice to continue was safe, and that the work could go on. The treatments arrived in beauty schools during this period as well. Students learning cosmetology in the late 2000s were taught Brazilian Blowout technique as part of the professional curriculum in many programs. This is how product knowledge enters an industry most durably, through the training of new professionals who carry what they learned into their careers and treat it as foundational. A stylist who learned to apply Brazilian Blowout in cosmetology school in 2009 would have been taught by an instructor who had learned from a trade show, who had learned from a distributor, who had learned from the manufacturer. The chain of instruction ran from commercial interest to educator to student, with occupational health as an afterthought at each link. The specific scent chemistry of a salon doing Brazilian treatments is worth a moment's attention, not because it is pleasant, but because it is informative. Formaldehyde at the concentrations released during treatment use has a characteristic odour that the human nose can detect at concentrations starting around 0.5 to 1 part per million, roughly the OSHA action level. At low concentrations, the smell is faintly sweet, almost vanilla adjacent, which is why it was sometimes described by clients as resembling the smell of hair being blow-dried, rather than the smell of a chemical being released. The sweetness is deceptive. It suggests something warm and slightly pleasant, rather than something the body is warning you about. At higher concentrations, the smell sharpens. It becomes acrid. It makes the eyes water and the throat tighten. These are the concentrations that Oregon OSHA measured during active Brazilian Blowout treatments. Concentrations at which the body's sensory systems are clearly registering an irritant, though the source of the irritation was not labelled or explained. Stylists who experienced these acute symptoms, the sharp smell, the burning eyes, the throat tightening, were experiencing their body's formaldehyde detection systems doing their job. The symptoms were information. The information had nowhere to go, because the label said the chemical was not there. The market context also matters. Brazilian Blowout was entering a beauty landscape that was already saturated with chemical treatments, each with their own risk profiles, each managed with varying degrees of care. Permanent wave solutions contain thioglycolate, a sulfur compound that smells powerfully of eggs and carries its own occupational hazard profile. Chemical relaxers used primarily by black women contain sodium hydroxide or guanidine hydroxide, highly alkaline compounds that can cause severe chemical burns with careless handling. Hair color products contain a range of chemicals including paraphenylenediamine, a known sensitizer associated with allergic reactions, and hydrogen peroxide, an oxidizer. Cosmetologists handled all of these products routinely, and the industry's approach to their safety was approximately consistent. Label compliance, some basic training, gloves available but not always used, ventilation that varied with the building. The regulatory infrastructure governing these chemical exposures was the same for Brazilian Blowout as for everything else. OSHA's General Duty Clause, the Hazard Communication Standard, and the specific formaldehyde standard for cases where formaldehyde was explicitly identified as present. The specific formaldehyde standard could not apply to Brazilian Blowout so long as the product was labelled as formaldehyde-free. This is the circular protection that a false label provided. By 2009, the treatment was being administered in tens of thousands of salons across the country. The number of stylists with regular exposure was substantial. A conservative estimate would put it in the tens of thousands as well. The number of clients who received the treatment at least once during these peak years would reach into the millions. No one was counting, precisely, because the system was not set up to count. This is what unmonitored occupational exposure looks like at scale. A large population, significant exposure, no registry, no tracking, no mechanism for connecting outcomes to antecedents years later when the consequences of exposure might manifest. The label on the original Brazilian Blowout professional smoothing solution said, among other things, that it was formaldehyde-free. This was the claim that would later become the centre of a great deal of uncomfortable conversation. It said formaldehyde-free on bottles being used in salons where the air concentration of formaldehyde was, at peak treatment time, more than 10 times the safe occupational limit established by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. This is not a small discrepancy. 10 times the limit is not a rounding error. It's a different category of thing entirely. To understand how a label could say formaldehyde-free while the product contained formaldehyde, you have to understand something about cosmetics regulation in the United States, which is to say, you have to understand something about a gap between what the public reasonably assumes and what the law actually requires. In most consumer categories, food, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, the manufacturer is required to demonstrate that a product is safe before it can be sold. The burden of proof runs towards safety. Cosmetics are different. The Food and Drug Administration has authority over cosmetic safety, but it does not require pre-market approval for most cosmetic products. Manufacturers are largely trusted to ensure their own products are safe. The FDA can act after the fact if a product is shown to cause harm, but it does not review ingredients or products before they reach the market. This regulatory structure has been in place, largely unchanged, since the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938. The cosmetics industry lobbied hard to keep it that way. This is not a secret. Industry trade associations have consistently opposed legislative efforts to expand FDA authority over cosmetic ingredients, and those efforts have consistently failed. The result is an industry that operates with considerable freedom to define its own safety standards, its own labeling conventions, its own disclosure practices. This is not unique to cosmetics. Many industries prefer self-regulation to external oversight, but it is particularly consequential in an industry where the word safe appears frequently on packaging and rarely requires any independent verification. The specific mechanism by which Brazilian Blowout could label its product formaldehyde-free, while the product released formaldehyde in use, involves a concept called methylene glycol. In aqueous solution, that is, when mixed with water, which is what hair care products contain, formaldehyde exists in chemical equilibrium with methylene glycol, a different compound. The industry position was that the product contained methylene glycol, not formaldehyde. The FDA's position, eventually stated clearly, was that this distinction was meaningless for safety purposes. When heat was applied, the methylene glycol converted back to formaldehyde and was released as gas. The chemical that reached the stylist's lungs was formaldehyde. Calling the precursor something else did not change what it became. But for several years that labelling claim held, and while it held, it served a purpose. It answered the question a cautious stylist or salon owner might ask. Is there formaldehyde in this? The label said no. The label was wrong, but the label existed, and it was easier to believe a label than to conduct independent air quality testing, which was expensive, required specialized equipment, and was not something any individual salon was equipped to do. It was also easier to believe a label that said what you wanted to hear. The treatment was profitable, clients loved it. Stylists, on the days when the headaches were not too bad, took a certain pride in the transformation they could offer. The label that said formaldehyde-free was not just a chemical claim, it was also a permission slip. It said that what you were doing was safe, that the headaches were something else, that the burning sensation at the back of your throat after a long day of treatments was just dryness, just the season, just one of those things. The company behind Brazilian Blowout Professional, GIB LLC, based in Los Angeles, was not a large pharmaceutical corporation. It was a smaller operation that had recognized a market opportunity and moved quickly to fill it. The speed of that movement and the scale of the success that followed had not been matched by a corresponding investment in safety testing. This is, again, not unusual in the cosmetics industry. It is a structural feature of a market where safety testing is voluntary and speed to market is rewarded. What is worth noting is the gap between what was known internally and what appeared on the label. In 2010, a California-based distributor submitted a sample of Brazilian Blowout to an independent laboratory for testing. The results showed formaldehyde at a concentration of approximately 10.6%, a concentration that would make the product one of the highest formaldehyde cosmetic preparations on the market. The company's response, when confronted with this data, was not to revise the label. It was to dispute the testing methodology. This is a move worth recognizing, because it appears with some regularity in the history of chemical safety disputes. When data conflicts with a commercial position, the first response is often not to examine the commercial position, but to question the data. The product was tested again. The results were similar. The label continued to say formaldehyde-free. Meanwhile, in Oregon, a state with particularly active occupational health enforcement, the Oregon Occupational Safety and Health Division began receiving reports from salon workers in 2010. The reports described symptoms: eye irritation, respiratory problems, nosebleeds. An Oregon OSHA inspector visited a salon and took air quality measurements. The results were striking enough that Oregon OSHA issued a hazard communication to all licensed salons in the state, specifically naming Brazilian Blowout and warning that the air formaldehyde concentrations measured during treatment use were well above the permissible exposure limit. Oregon was the first state to act. It would not be the last, but it would take time. The federal OSHA began its own investigation. The FDA began its own investigation. These investigations ran on their own timelines, which are not the timelines of the salon floor. They ran while stylists continued to apply the treatment. They ran while clients continued to sit in chairs. They ran while the label continued to say what it said. A note about the smell of formaldehyde at low concentrations, because this matters more than it might seem. At concentrations below about 1 part per million, formaldehyde is largely odorless. Most people cannot detect it. At the concentrations measured in salon air during Brazilian Blowout treatments, concentrations that ranged in various studies from 0.87 parts per million to over 5 parts per million, with some measurements considerably higher, the smell is perceptible to some people and not others. It has been described as slightly sweet, or slightly sharp, or simply as chemical, the way people describe a smell when they do not have a more specific word for it. The nose, in any case, is not a reliable instrument for measuring what the air contains. The body's response to formaldehyde exposure is not always immediate, not always dramatic, not always distinguishable from the ordinary discomforts of a long working day in a space with imperfect ventilation. The headache, the burning eyes, the dry throat. The stylist who had worked in salons for 15 years knew about headaches. She knew about the end-of-the-day feeling, the particular fatigue of standing on hard floors under hot lights for 8 hours. She did not necessarily know she was being chronically exposed to a known carcinogen at concentrations that exceeded occupational safety standards. The label had said it was safe. In 2011, the FDA sent a warning letter to GIB LLC, the manufacturer of Brazilian Blowout. The letter cited the company's formaldehyde-free claims as misbranding under federal law. It noted the independent testing results. It stated clearly that the FDA considered the product to be misbranded and potentially harmful. The letter was publicly available. It was reported on by beauty trade publications, by some health journalists, by OSHA communications. It entered the public record. And then, in many salons, things continued largely as before. The product remained available. The label was eventually revised. The formaldehyde-free claim was removed from the professional product. But the treatment itself did not disappear. The market for smoothing treatments was too large, and the demand was too consistent, and the alternatives being developed by competitors were often chemically similar, even when they were marketed differently. This is the particular rhythm of chemical safety stories. the investigation, the finding, the warning letter, and then the long, uneven, incomplete process by which information filters into practice. The FDA warning letter was a real event with real regulatory force. It was also a document that many salon owners never read, that many stylists never heard of, that many clients sitting in chairs in 2012, 2013, 2014 had no particular reason to know existed. The salon smells like product. It always smells like product. That is the nature of salons. You learn not to notice. The question of how a label can say one thing while a product contains another is not purely a question of fraud. It is also a question of regulatory architecture. Cosmetic labeling in the United States is governed by 21 CFR Part 701, which requires that cosmetic labels be truthful and not misleading, but which does not require that manufacturers submit their labels to the FDA for review before using them. The review happens after the fact, if it happens at all, which means a false or misleading label can reach the market and remain there for years before the regulatory mechanism identifies and acts on it. This is the temporal gap at the heart of post-market cosmetic regulation. The product is out there, in use, while the evaluation occurs. Every month the evaluation is incomplete, more exposure occurs. The gap between the product entering the market and any regulatory response to its problems is measured in months or years, not days. During that interval, which in the Brazilian Blowout case stretched from approximately 2005 to 2011, millions of exposures accumulated in the absence of accurate safety information. The ingredient declaration requirements for cosmetics are similarly structured around disclosure of what is in the product in its formulation state rather than what the product releases in use. A product that contains methylene glycol must list methylene glycol or an equivalent chemical name. It does not need to declare that the methylene glycol will become formaldehyde under heat, because that transformation happens after the product has left the bottle. The label describes the contents of the bottle, not the airborne chemistry of the application. This gap between what is in the bottle and what enters the air is not unique to Brazilian Blowout. Any volatile component of a cosmetic product that evaporates during use creates an inhalation exposure that is not necessarily represented by reading the ingredient list. Fragrances, solvents, and various functional ingredients all contribute to the air quality in spaces where cosmetics are used intensively. The salon air is a composite of everything being used in the space, and reading any individual product's label tells you something about that composite, but not the whole of it. The specific claim at issue, formaldehyde-free, was an affirmative safety claim which carries higher regulatory stakes than a simple omission. Under the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, cosmetics must not be misbranded. Misbranding includes false or misleading labeling. A label that claims formaldehyde-free for a product that releases formaldehyde in ordinary use is, under any plain reading of this provision, misbranded. The question the FDA had to navigate was how clearly this was established and what the appropriate enforcement action was. Warning letters are not the only tool in the FDA's enforcement kit. The agency can pursue injunctions, seizures, and criminal referrals for serious violations. It can also simply decline to take formal action, and instead issue guidance or use informal communication to encourage compliance. The range of responses available gives regulators discretion that is appropriate in a system designed to handle the full spectrum, from minor technical violations to serious public health threats, but which can also mean that serious violations receive lighter responses than their seriousness warrants when the agency's resources are stretched or its political environment is unfavourable to aggressive enforcement. The FDA's Office of Cosmetics and Colours, which has primary responsibility for cosmetics oversight, has historically been one of the more resource-constrained offices in the FDA. Cosmetics are a lower priority category than drugs and medical devices, where pre-market approval requirements create ongoing regulatory activity that justifies staffing and budget. Cosmetics enforcement is primarily reactive. The office responds to complaints and conducts inspections when it has reason to, rather than conducting systematic market surveillance. The Brazilian Blowout case came to the office's attention through the state-level investigations and the public complaints that followed, not through a proactive monitoring program. The specific testing methodology used in evaluating Brazilian Blowout products also became a technical battleground. The company's position was that different testing methods would produce different results, and that the methods used by the Oregon and federal investigators overstated the formaldehyde content. This is a standard argument in chemical safety disputes, The methods by which a hazardous substance is detected affect what is detected and at what concentration. Different methods can produce different results for legitimate technical reasons. The FDA and OSHA used established, validated testing methodologies, the kinds of methods that had been used to measure formaldehyde in industrial settings for decades and that had been accepted by courts and regulatory bodies as reliable. The specific measurement of air quality during treatment use, taking real-time air samples in a salon where a treatment was actively being applied, was as close to a direct measurement of occupational exposure as you can get. These measurements were not artifacts of methodology, they were what was in the air. In the summer of 2011, a laboratory analysis commissioned by Oregon OSHA found formaldehyde at 10.6% by weight in a sample of the professional product. This is a remarkable number. Cosmetic products are typically formulated at much lower concentrations of any single active ingredient. A 10.6% formaldehyde concentration means that more than 1 in 10 molecules of the product by weight was formaldehyde or its immediate precursor. When this concentration was volatilized during the flat iron phase of the treatment, the resulting air concentrations were what the measurements consistently showed, multiples of the OSHA permissible exposure limit. The company's response to this analysis was to dispute it. This is their prerogative. Companies are entitled to contest regulatory findings they believe are wrong, and the regulatory process is designed to accommodate that contestation. The process of contestation takes time, and during that time, in most cases, the product remains available. This is a feature, not a bug, of the regulatory system as designed, a system that is cautious about removing products from the market without due process. It is also, from the perspective of the workers being exposed during the contestation period, a feature with significant human cost. Her name, for the purposes of this story, is Renata. She's been doing hair for 11 years. She's 34 years old. She has a station at a mid-range salon in a suburb of Seattle, the kind of salon that does a brisk trade in colour corrections and the occasional bridal party and, since 2008, Brazilian Blowout treatments. Renata is good at her job. She's quick and she's gentle, and her clients trust her, which is its own kind of intimacy, the particular trust of someone who lets you hold their head. Renata's day begins at 9 in the morning, sometimes 8:30 if there is a colour client who needs to be in the chair early. The salon smells when she arrives, the way salons smell after they have been closed overnight, a concentrated version of all the products that have been used and dried and heated in the space, a smell that dissipates within the first hour of the day opening, replaced by the fresher versions of those same smells as the day's work begins. She makes coffee in the back room, she reviews her books. She has a Brazilian Blowout at 10, another at 2, a colour at 12, 2 cuts around it. It is a full day. The Brazilian Blowout application takes approximately 2 hours, sometimes more for longer or thicker hair. The process involves washing the hair, applying the treatment solution with a brush, allowing it to sit for 20 minutes to half an hour, blow-drying the hair straight, and then going over it in small sections with a flat iron set to somewhere between 400 and 450 degrees. The heat is what seals the treatment. The sections need to overlap slightly. This takes time. The flat iron emits a small amount of steam as it contacts the treatment-saturated hair. The steam carries formaldehyde. Renata has done enough of these treatments to have a system. She works quickly through the sections, starting at the nape of the neck, working up to the crown, finishing with the face-framing pieces. Her hands know the motion. She can get through a full treatment in the lower end of that 2-hour range when everything goes smoothly, when the hair is not particularly resistant, when the client sits still. By the time Renata's 10 o'clock client is leaving, the salon's air carries a particular quality that regular clients have learned to associate with the treatment. Some find it pleasant, slightly warm, slightly chemical, the smell they have come to associate with emerging from the appointment with smoother hair. Others find it irritating. A small number have mentioned that the smell gives them headaches. Renata herself, if you asked her honestly, would tell you she has gotten used to it. Most smells become normal with enough exposure. The brain is good at editing out what remains constant. What Renata does not know, what no one in the salon knows because no one has measured it, is that the air in the salon during a Brazilian Blowout treatment contains formaldehyde at concentrations that routinely exceed the OSHA permissible exposure limit of 0.75 parts per million as an 8-hour time-weighted average. During the flat iron phase of the treatment, peak concentrations can reach significantly higher. Studies conducted by OSHA and independent researchers will later find that in poorly ventilated salons, and most salons are poorly ventilated by industrial chemical standards, because they were designed for hair, not for industrial chemistry, peak formaldehyde concentrations during treatment use can reach 3, 4, 5 times the permissible limit, with some measurements higher still. The product label says formaldehyde-free. Renata has read this. It makes sense to her. The company has told her the product is keratin-based. Keratin is a protein. It is what hair is made of. The idea of a protein-based treatment seems natural, almost wholesome, in the way that words like keratin and amino acids suggest something the body already understands. She has not been given reason to question this. She has, over the past 2 years, developed a cough that comes and goes. She has attributed this to allergies. She has always been slightly allergic to something, and the salon environment is not the most pristine air to spend 8 hours in. She has also noticed that her eyes water more on the days when she does multiple Brazilian treatments, but this has always seemed to her like the kind of thing that happens in a salon, the way her hands are always slightly dry from washing them between clients, the way her feet always ache by 5 o'clock. These are the textures of her work life. She does not track them as symptoms, she tracks them as weather. The 2 o'clock Brazilian takes a little longer than usual. The client has very thick hair, and Renata makes sure to go over each section twice with the flat iron. By the time she is finished, it is nearly 4:30, and the salon has been holding elevated formaldehyde concentrations for most of the day. The ventilation system has been running, but the ventilation system was designed for a hair salon, not a salon also administering a treatment that requires industrial-strength air exchange to maintain safe conditions. This distinction was not made clear to anyone who purchased the ventilation system. It was not made clear to the salon owner when she bought the product. There is a specific OSHA standard for formaldehyde exposure in occupational settings. It was established in 1992 following research that showed clear links between chronic formaldehyde exposure and nasopharyngeal cancer. The standard requires that employers provide respiratory protection to employees when formaldehyde levels exceed 0.1 parts per million, the action level. It requires engineering controls, ventilation for example, to reduce exposures below the permissible exposure limit. It requires training for workers about the hazards of formaldehyde. It requires medical surveillance for workers with significant exposures. None of this was happening in most salons using Brazilian Blowout, because no one had told the salon owners that a formaldehyde standard applied to their workplace. The product was labelled as formaldehyde-free. The standard did not seem relevant. The Stylist was not being thought of as a chemical worker, which is what she had become. Renata goes home at 6. Her feet ache, which is normal. Her eyes feel dry, which is also normal for this time of year. She makes dinner. She watches something she barely remembers afterward. She falls asleep easily, which she always has. The exhaustion of a full day on her feet makes sleep reliable. She's not thinking about the air she breathed today. She has no particular reason to. There are in the United States approximately 660,000 cosmetologists licensed to practice. The overwhelming majority of them are women. A 2013 survey found that cosmetologists have elevated rates of certain cancers compared to the general population: bladder cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma. These are cancers associated with occupational chemical exposure. The data does not tell individual stories. It describes population patterns. It suggests that the work of making people look beautiful carries chemical risks that have not been adequately measured, disclosed, or regulated. Renata does not know this. Most of her colleagues do not know this. The information exists in occupational medicine literature, in epidemiology journals, in OSHA records. But it has not made its way into the training she received, into the continuing education credits she has to complete each year to maintain her license, into the product information sheets for the chemicals she works with daily. It exists in the gap between what researchers know and what workers are told. This gap has a name in occupational health. It is called the information hazard gap. It is not unique to the beauty industry. It appears wherever workers are exposed to chemicals whose risks are known to regulators and researchers, but not communicated effectively to the people who handle those chemicals daily. It is a gap that tends to be widest for the workers, with the least institutional power. Workers who are not unionized, who who are often self-employed or employed in small businesses, who lack the occupational health infrastructure that larger industries provide. A cosmetologist working in a small salon handling a product labelled as safe has very little structural support for knowing what she's actually being exposed to. She has the label. She has what her training told her, which in most cases was focused on technique and client relations, not toxicology. She has the accumulating experience of her own body, which is telling her something, but which has not yet learned to read what it is being told. The flat iron leaves a slight smell in the air after each section, hot metal and something sweeter underneath. Renata has always thought of it as the smell of the treatment working. She's not wrong about that. It is the smell of the chemistry happening. What the smell contains, she has never been told. By the time anyone official measured the air in a salon like Renata's, she had been doing Brazilian treatments for 4 years. The investigation that followed the measurement would eventually, years later, result in changes to product formulations, to labelling requirements, to industry practices. Those changes would arrive on their own timeline. In the meantime, the salon would open at 9 and close at 7, and the flat irons would run through the afternoon, and Renata would drive home in the dark with the particular tiredness of a long day, and the radio playing something she was not quite listening to. The hair she treated was beautiful, though, that was real too. Renata's working conditions were not unusual for a cosmetologist in her demographic and geographic situation. She rented her station in a 6-chair salon, owned by a woman who had been in the business for 20 years. The owner was not careless. She'd attended the training the distributor offered when she began stocking Brazilian Blowout. The training focused on application technique, how to section the hair properly, how to control the flat iron temperature, how to achieve even results on different hair types. It did not address formaldehyde, the label said there was none. Station rental is the predominant model of employment in American salons. Rather than employing stylists directly, which would make them responsible for workers' compensation, payroll taxes, and the full array of employer obligations, most salon owners rent individual stations to stylists who operate as independent contractors. The stylist pays her rent, keeps her clients, handles her own scheduling, and manages her own business within the space the salon provides. This arrangement has significant advantages for stylists who want professional autonomy, and it has significant disadvantages for workers who need institutional protection. An independent contractor does not receive workers' compensation coverage from the salon owner, at least not in most states. She handles her own insurance. If she develops an occupational illness, the path to compensation is through her own legal resources and her own initiative. The shift from employee to independent contractor in the beauty industry has been ongoing for decades and reflects a broader pattern in service industries where the costs and obligations of employment are transferred from employer to worker. This transfer is presented as flexibility, and it does provide flexibility. A stylist who wants to take a week off can do so without navigating an employer's leave policies. But it also transfers risk, including the occupational health risk that comes from working in a chemically complex environment without employer-provided safety infrastructure. The ventilation in Renata's salon was a system installed when the strip mall was built, designed to heat and cool the retail space efficiently. It circulated air, but it did not specifically exhaust air to the outside. It recirculated filtered air through the building. This distinction matters for formaldehyde specifically, because formaldehyde is not effectively filtered by standard HVAC filters. A standard HVAC filter removes particulate matter, dust, hair, larger particles, but does not capture gases. Formaldehyde, being a gas at room temperature, passes through a standard HVAC filter and recirculates through the space. To remove gaseous formaldehyde from the air, you need either dilution ventilation, bringing in large amounts of outside air to dilute the concentration, or local exhaust ventilation, capturing the formaldehyde at the source before it disperses into the room. The OSHA formaldehyde standard specifies that engineering controls should be used to maintain formaldehyde levels below the permissible exposure limit, and it describes local exhaust ventilation as the preferred approach where high concentrations are generated. Local exhaust ventilation at a flat iron station would look something like the exhaust hood above a kitchen stove, a capture device positioned close to the source of the emission, connected to ductwork that exhausts the air outside. No such system existed in Renata's salon, or in the vast majority of salons doing Brazilian blowout treatments. The infrastructure did not exist, had not been required, and was not something that salon owners would have known to provide because the product they were using was labelled as formaldehyde-free, making the formaldehyde engineering control standard appear not to apply. On the days when Renata administered multiple Brazilian treatments, and busy Saturdays could involve 3 or 4 treatments in succession, the formaldehyde concentrations in the salon air built through the day. Each treatment added its own peak release during the flat iron phase. Between treatments, concentrations declined as the air moved through the recirculation system, but they did not return to baseline before the next treatment began. By mid-afternoon, on a busy day, the salon's air carried a cumulative chemical load that reflected hours of treatment administration. Renata noticed that she felt worse on these days than on days with fewer or no Brazilian treatments. She noticed that her eyes were redder at the end of heavy treatment days. She noticed that the cough she had developed seemed to be worse on Tuesdays and Saturdays, which were her busiest treatment days. She had not yet connected these observations to a pattern, because no one had told her there was a pattern to look for. The psychological phenomenon of not connecting the dots, of having all the pieces of information but not assembling them into a conclusion, is not stupidity. It is the natural result of operating without a frame. When no one tells you that the product you're using can cause the symptoms you're experiencing, and when the product's label explicitly claims it does not contain the chemical that causes those symptoms, you look elsewhere for the explanation. The cough is seasonal. The red eyes are from the product in general. Salons always irritate the eyes a little. The headaches are from long days. Each individual observation has an alternative explanation, and in the absence of information connecting them to a common cause, the alternative explanations do the work. This is also why the first stylists who connected the dots, the Portland salon workers who called Oregon OSHA, represent a significant and underappreciated contribution to public health. Someone had to assemble the pattern. Someone had to make the decision that the explanation the label provided was inadequate and that the regulatory system should be involved. This required overcoming a significant amount of inertia, the inertia of a working relationship with a product, the inertia of a professional environment where questioning the safety of standard products can feel disruptive, the inertia of uncertainty about whether the symptoms were really connected to the product or were just part of the general experience of working in a salon. The willingness to report, to call OSHA, to file a complaint, to say this does not seem right and I am going to say so, is not something that can be taken for granted in any industry, and it is particularly fraught in industries where workers have precarious employment relationships and where making trouble can have professional consequences. The stylists who called Oregon OSHA were not doing something easy. They were doing something that required a particular kind of civic courage, and the investigation that followed, and the FDA warning letter that eventually resulted, and the improvements to labelling and industry practice that came from that, all of it has a thread that runs back to the decision those workers made to say something. If you wanted to understand what the treatment meant to the women who sought it out, you could do worse than to start with hair. Not with chemistry, not with regulation, but with the specific, intimate, often lifelong relationship that women have with their own hair, particularly women with curly, coily, textured or frizz-prone hair who had grown up in a culture that consistently told them something was wrong with what grew naturally from their scalps. The beauty industry is long at this. It has been telling women, particularly black women and women of colour, that their natural hair requires correction since at least the early 20th century, when Madam C.J. Walker made her fortune selling hair straightening products to African American women who wanted to participate in the mainstream professional world, which had its own ideas about what professional hair looked like. Walker herself was a complicated figure. She became the first female self-made millionaire in America, and she gave generously to civil rights organizations, and the products she sold met a genuine market need as that need had been created and sustained by a culture of discrimination. But the underlying message of the market she built was not ambiguous. Straight is better. Straight is professional. Straight is the goal. This message had not diminished by the early 2000s. It had, in some respects, intensified. The proliferation of beauty media, magazines, television, later the internet, had multiplied the images of idealized hair, and those images were overwhelmingly images of straight hair, smooth hair, hair that fell in a clean line and did not develop a mind of its own in humidity. Women with naturally wavy or curly hair spent significant portions of their mornings fighting with their hair. They made product choices around it. They planned their days around whether it was going to rain. The Brazilian Blowout offered them something genuinely compelling, a way to opt out of that fight, at least for a few months. The treatment's popularity was not manufactured by advertising alone. It was driven by word of mouth between women who had tried it and found that it worked. Clients told their friends, friends made appointments. The transformation was visible and immediate. You walked in with one kind of hair and walked out with another kind entirely. The mirror showed you this. The experience of washing your hair the next morning confirmed it. For women who had never known what their hair felt like when it was not fighting with itself, this was not a small thing. It was also not permanent. After about 3 months, the treatment began to fade. The curl and wave pattern gradually returned. The appointment cycle began again. This was, from the salon's perspective, an ideal product design. High margin, repeat purchase, experiential rather than take home. Clients did not buy a bottle. They bought time in the chair over and over because the chair was where the transformation happened. The price point, typically between $200 and $500 for a full treatment, meant that Brazilian Blowout clients tended to be women with disposable income. It was not exclusively a luxury service, but it was not a budget service either. The salons that offered it were, on average, salons where the clientele expected a certain level of quality, a certain level of care, a certain implicit promise that what was being done to them was safe. Salons worked hard to cultivate this feeling. The good chairs, the warm lighting, the small rituals of hospitality, the coffee offered when you arrived, the neck massage with the shampoo, were all part of communicating trustworthiness. The client trusted the salon. The salon trusted the product. The product label said formaldehyde-free. This is how trust becomes a vector for risk, in the most ordinary, unseeable way. What the client noticed during the treatment was usually the smell. She might describe it differently depending on her sensitivity: chemical, slightly sweet, medicinal, or just producty in a general way that salons always were. She might mention a slight burning sensation in her eyes toward the end, when the flat iron had been running for a while. She might develop a mild headache, which she would attribute to the heat of the blow dryer or the fact that she had skipped breakfast. In most cases, she would leave the salon feeling largely fine, perhaps a little lightheaded from being in a warm enclosed space for 2 hours, but not alarmed. She would return in 3 months. For clients who received treatments less frequently than the stylists who applied them, the cumulative exposure was lower. The health concerns associated with Brazilian Blowout were most serious for the stylists who administered the treatment daily. But the clients were not without exposure, and some clients received treatments multiple times a year for multiple years, accumulating doses that their bodies were not warned about and their doctors were not tracking. There is no national registry of Brazilian Blowout treatments. There is no database of client exposures. The women who received multiple treatments over several years cannot know, in any specific way, what cumulative formaldehyde dose they received. This information was not collected. It was not someone's job to collect it. The clients were customers in a service transaction, not subjects in a study, and the system was not designed to track what happened to them after they walked out the door with their new hair. What the women experienced in the short term varied. Some felt fine throughout. Some had eye irritation that cleared within hours of leaving the salon. Some developed what they described as a strange taste at the back of their throat. Formaldehyde has a distinctive flavour at higher concentrations, or rather a distinctive sensation, something between sweetness and chemical sharpness that the tongue does not have a clean category for. Some went home with headaches. A small number had more significant reactions: respiratory symptoms, asthma exacerbations, in rare cases skin reactions from direct contact with the product. The women who had more significant reactions tended to be women who were already sensitized to formaldehyde from prior exposure, or women with pre-existing respiratory conditions, or women who happened to sit in the chair during a particularly poorly ventilated session. These variables were invisible to everyone involved in the transaction. The salon did not know which clients were sensitized. The clients did not know what they were being exposed to. The stylist was managing her own exposure while simultaneously managing the client's hair. What is notable about the client experience is how rarely it was framed, even afterward, as a safety question. Clients who had unpleasant experiences during treatments often attributed them to personal sensitivity, to having a delicate system, to the general category of things that happen in salons and are understood to be the minor price of beauty. The word formaldehyde did not enter most of these conversations. The label had said it was not there. In 2011 and 2012, after the FDA warning letter and the OSHA investigations had received some press coverage, a portion of clients began asking questions. Are you still using Brazilian Blowout? What's in it exactly? I read something about formaldehyde. Salons responded in various ways. Some discontinued the treatment, some switched to products marketed as formaldehyde-free reformulations. Some offered reassurances that the concerns had been addressed, that the new formula was different, that the levels were well within safe ranges. These reassurances were sometimes accurate, sometimes not, and it was not always possible for the client asking the question to know the difference. The replacement products that emerged after the controversy were marketed aggressively on their safety credentials. Formaldehyde-free was still appearing on labels, now for products whose chemical composition, when tested, sometimes still released formaldehyde because the methylene glycol chemistry had not changed. Only the marketing language around it had. The FDA had stated clearly that methylene glycol and formaldehyde were the same hazard for practical purposes. This statement had not been universally received. What the client deserved, and what the system was not consistently providing, was simple information. What was in the product being applied to her hair in a closed room, and what that substance did at the concentration she was being exposed to. This is not a complicated ask. It is the minimum that informed consent requires. The gap between that ask and what was actually provided is where most of the story lives. She wanted good hair. This was not an unreasonable thing to want. It was also not, in any available version of fairness, her responsibility to have anticipated what the salon's product contained and what the product company's label had gotten wrong. She gets up from the chair. She catches a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She looks good. The stylist hands her a small card with care instructions. She pays. She makes another appointment. The door opens and she steps out into the air. Ordinary air, the kind no one has measured and no one is worried about. And the city receives her, and she goes on with her day. The women who sought Brazilian blowout treatments were not a monolithic group, and the reasons they sought them were not reducible to a single social narrative, however compelling the social narrative might be. Some were looking for a specific technical solution to a specific hair problem, the kind of fine, humidity-sensitive hair that expanded unpredictably in damp weather. Some had textured or coily hair, and were navigating a professional environment that did not always make space for natural hair textures. Some were simply curious about something a friend had tried. Some had read about it in a magazine and wanted to see if it worked as advertised. The intersection of race, hair, and the Brazilian blowout market is part of this story, though not all of it. The straightening treatment market in the United States has historically been divided by hair type, with different products marketed to different populations. Chemical relaxers marketed primarily to black women with tightly coiled hair, Japanese straightening marketed primarily to Asian women with particular hair textures, and Brazilian treatments initially marketed more broadly, but adopted across racial and ethnic lines according to the specific compatibility with different hair types and the specific desire each client brought to the appointment. For black women in particular, the relationship between professional hair care and occupational chemical exposure has a longer and more complex history. Chemical relaxers, products containing sodium hydroxide or guanidine hydroxide, which break and remake the disulfide bonds in hair proteins, have been used by black women in the United States since the mid-20th century and represent a significantly larger occupational exposure in aggregate than Brazilian blowout, though a different chemical mechanism and different hazard profile. Studies of hair salon workers have consistently found that black stylists have among the highest occupational chemical exposures in the industry, given the higher frequency of relaxer use in their client base and the particular chemistry of relaxer products. The 2015 National Institutes of Health Sister Study, which enrolled tens of thousands of sisters of women with breast cancer and followed them for years, found a statistically significant association between hair product use, specifically chemical relaxers and other straightening products, and breast cancer risk among black women. The study's findings have continued to accumulate, and subsequent research has strengthened the association. The Black Women's Health Study has found similar associations. These studies don't isolate Brazilian blowout as a specific variable. but they describe a larger pattern of chemical exposure through hair products that the Brazilian Blowout controversy opened a window onto. The women in the client chairs during the Brazilian Blowout years were seeking something real. The desire to be at ease in one's own appearance, to spend less of one's limited morning hours managing hair, to enter professional spaces without a particular kind of self-consciousness. These are not trivial desires, and the products that promised to address them were not responding to manufactured needs. The needs were real. The question was whether the products addressing them were telling the truth about what they contained, and what that meant for the bodies of the people using them. A client who received multiple Brazilian treatments over several years was not making an irrational choice. She was making a choice based on the information available to her, which was incomplete, and in the specific case of the formaldehyde content actively inaccurate. If she had been told, clearly and specifically, that the treatment involved exposure to a known carcinogen at concentrations that exceeded occupational safety standards, she might have made a different choice. Or she might have chosen to accept that risk as a personal decision in the same way that people make other decisions about risk. What she was not given was the opportunity to make an informed decision, because the information required for informed decision-making was withheld from her by a label that said what it said. This is what the concept of informed consent means in the consumer product context. Not that the product must be without risk, but that the known risks must be disclosed in a way that allows the person who will bear those risks to evaluate them. The pharmaceutical industry operates under this framework for prescription medications. The informed consent process, the package insert, the medication guide for patients. Because the risks of pharmaceutical products are taken seriously, and because patients are understood to have a right to weigh those risks for themselves. The cosmetics industry is not subject to an equivalent framework, and the Brazilian Blowout case illustrates what that absence means in practice. The clients who received Brazilian treatments and later learned about the formaldehyde findings had a range of responses. Some were alarmed and sought medical evaluation. Some felt deceived in a way that shaded into betrayal. The Salon, which they had trusted with their physical appearance and their health, had applied something that the label said was safe and that turned out not to be. Some shrugged it off, particularly those who'd received only occasional treatments and who felt that their exposure was probably at the lower end of the distribution. Some became advocates, sharing the information with friends who were still getting treatments, asking questions at their salons, writing about it on the consumer review platforms that were becoming the new venue for public safety knowledge. The advocacy that emerged from the client community was, in its way, as important as the regulatory investigation. Regulatory investigations are slow and bounded by legal standards of evidence. Consumer advocacy on the internet, while less authoritative, reaches people quickly and in the spaces where they make their decisions. The review platforms, the beauty forums, the online communities where women share product experiences. The Brazilian Blowout story was discussed extensively in these spaces from 2010 onward, and the discussion reached women who had never heard of the Oregon OSHA investigation and would not have thought to look for an FDA warning letter, but were reading beauty forum posts before booking their next appointment. The client who asks a question at the salon because she read something on a forum is not a nuisance. She's a person doing the work of a safety system that has not been built out in the places where it is most needed. Every question asked, every time a stylist was prompted to look at a safety data sheet, every time a salon owner responded to client questions by investigating the product further, these were moments in which safety information was spreading through channels the official system had not provided. Oregon, in the occupational health world, has a reputation. The state has historically been more aggressive than the federal OSHA in pursuing workplace chemical hazards, and its inspectors have a history of acting on worker complaints that the federal agency might log and revisit eventually. This is a matter of institutional culture and state budget priorities, and the particular personalities that end up in state occupational health agencies. Which is to say, it is mostly luck. The luck of which state you happen to be working in when the problem developed. The complaint that triggered the Oregon investigation in 2010 came from salon workers. A group of stylists working in a Portland salon that was doing high-volume Brazilian blowout treatments had noticed that their symptoms, the headaches, the burning eyes, the respiratory irritation, were specifically worse on the days when they administered multiple treatments back to back. They had done what workers rarely do, which is to connect the pattern to the product. They had called Oregon OSHA. An inspector was dispatched. He brought an air monitoring device. He measured formaldehyde concentrations in the Salon air during an active Brazilian blowout treatment, specifically during the flat iron phase, which is when formaldehyde release peaks. The number he recorded was 5.35 parts per million. The OSHA permissible exposure limit, the ceiling concentration that workers should never be exposed to even briefly, is 2 parts per million. The short-term exposure limit, the concentration allowed for a maximum of 15 minutes, is 2 parts per million. The action level at which protective measures must be implemented is 0.5 parts per million. At 5.35 parts per million, the air in that salon was telling a specific story, and the inspector wrote it down. Oregon OSHA issued its hazard alert in the spring of 2010, the alert named Brazilian Blowout specifically. It described the formaldehyde measurements obtained in Oregon salons. It described the health effects of formaldehyde exposure: eye, nose, throat and lung irritation, headache, the longer-term risks associated with repeated high-level exposure. It advised salon owners to evaluate whether they were using products containing formaldehyde to ensure adequate ventilation, to consider whether respiratory protection should be provided to stylists. It provided the contact information for Oregon OSHA's consultation division. This alert existed. It was publicly available on the Oregon OSHA website. It was distributed to licensed salons in Oregon. It reached the salons it was supposed to reach through the regulatory channels available. What it could not do was reach salons in the 49 other states where Brazilian Blowout was being used and where no equivalent investigation had yet taken place. The alert was picked up by some beauty industry trade publications. It was noticed by hair care researchers and occupational health advocates. It circulated in the specific professional communities where these things circulate, among stylists who were already concerned about chemical exposure in their workplaces, among salon owners who paid attention to industry news, among occupational health professionals who followed OSHA activities. It did not reach Renata working in her suburban Seattle salon, or the hundreds of thousands of stylists like her who were not connected to these networks and who had no particular reason to seek them out. The federal OSHA began its own investigation in 2010, prompted in part by Oregon's findings and in part by complaints from stylists in other states who had heard about the Oregon alert through various channels. OSHA field investigators visited salons in multiple states and collected air samples during Brazilian blowout treatments. Their results were consistent with what Oregon had found. Formaldehyde concentrations during treatment use regularly exceeded OSHA standards, in some cases significantly. OSHA also obtained samples of Brazilian blowout product and submitted them to the OSHA laboratory for analysis. The laboratory found formaldehyde in the product at concentrations substantially higher than the label claimed. A separate analysis by an independent laboratory, commissioned by Oregon OSHA, found formaldehyde at approximately 10.6% of the product by weight, a concentration that, when released during the flat iron phase, produced the air concentrations that had been measured. The FDA was simultaneously conducting its own investigation, though the FDA and OSHA operate under different statutory authorities and with different resources and priorities. The FDA's authority here derived from the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, which gives it oversight of cosmetics but with a significant limitation already described. It does not require pre-market approval, and its enforcement authority is bounded by specific provisions that can make action slow. The FDA sent inspectors to GIBL LLC, the company behind Brazilian Blowout. The inspectors reviewed the company's records, its testing data, its labeling practices. What they found was a company that had, at minimum, not conducted adequate testing to support the claims on its label, and that had, in the judgment of the FDA, been making misbranding claims by calling a formaldehyde-containing product formaldehyde-free. The FDA warning letter, when it came in 2011, was a formal regulatory action. Warning letters are not the most aggressive tool in the FDA's arsenal. They are not criminal charges, they are not product seizures, they are not product seizures, they are not recalls. They are, as their name suggests, warnings, formal notices that the agency has found violations of the law and that the company is expected to correct those violations. The company has an opportunity to respond, to explain how it will come into compliance, to contest the findings if it chooses. GIB LLC contested some of the findings. The company maintained that its product was not misbranded, that the methylene glycol present in the formula was distinct from formaldehyde, that the FDA's characterization of the chemistry was incorrect. The company hired lawyers and engaged with the regulatory process in the way that companies engaged in regulatory disputes do, carefully, incrementally, with an eye toward minimizing required changes while satisfying the minimum threshold of compliance. This back and forth is normal regulatory procedure. It is not a failure of the system exactly. The system is designed for this kind of iterative negotiation. What it means in practice is that the resolution of the dispute takes time, months, sometimes years, during which the product being disputed continues to be used. This is the rhythm of regulatory enforcement, and it is a rhythm that runs considerably slower than the rhythm of exposure. In 2011, a class action lawsuit was filed against GIBL LC on behalf of consumers who alleged they had been harmed or deceived by the Brazilian Blowout product. A separate lawsuit was filed by Salon workers. The lawsuits alleged that the company had known its formaldehyde-free label was false, that it had failed to warn users of the risks associated with the product, and that users had been damaged as a result. Litigation is slower than regulation, which is itself slower than exposure. The lawsuits would take years to resolve. They would result in settlements. In 2012, GIBLLC reached a settlement with the Federal Trade Commission over its marketing claims, and later with attorneys general from multiple states. The settlements required changes to labeling and marketing practices. They did not include admissions of liability. In the beauty industry press, the story had a particular valence. There were sympathetic articles about the consumers and workers who had been affected. There were also articles that framed the issue as one of regulatory overreach, as government interference in an industry that was capable of regulating itself. The formaldehyde-free claim was, in this framing, a misunderstanding of chemistry rather than a misrepresentation. The hazards had been overstated. The product had been unfairly targeted. This is a familiar argumentative structure in chemical safety disputes. The claim that the hazard is exaggerated, that the science is uncertain, that the regulatory response is disproportionate. It is not always wrong. Regulatory agencies do sometimes overreach. Science is sometimes genuinely uncertain. But in this case, the science was not uncertain. Formaldehyde was a known carcinogen. Methylene glycol converting to formaldehyde under heat was not a disputed chemical fact. The measurements in the salons were reproducible and consistent. The argument that the hazard was exaggerated was an argument made by people with a financial interest in that conclusion, against the weight of evidence being gathered by people whose job it was to measure what was actually there. The women breathing the air in those salons did not have the luxury of waiting for the argument to resolve. Their lungs were operating in real time. Outside, in the parking lot of the Oregon Salon where the first measurements had been taken, a stylist sat in her car on her lunch break, eating a sandwich and looking at her phone. The spring light came through the windshield. The radio was on at low volume. She had 11 years left in her career. She was thinking about her next client. She was not thinking about what she'd been breathing all morning, because no one had told her. The Oregon OSHA investigation was a slow-developing story even within occupational health circles. The hazard alert was issued in May 2010 and reached Oregon salons through the direct communication channels that state OSHA maintains with licensed facilities. Oregon OSHA also notified the federal OSHA, whose response was to begin its own evaluation, a process that involved coordinating with multiple regional field offices, developing an investigation protocol, and beginning the process of laboratory testing that would take several months. Federal OSHA field investigations are resource-intensive. OSHA has approximately 1,800 inspectors for the entire country, a staffing level that has been criticized by occupational health advocates for decades as inadequate for monitoring the safety of American workplaces. With that staffing, OSHA prioritizes investigations based on complaint severity, industry risk profile, and available intelligence. The beauty salon industry had not historically been a high priority for OSHA investigation. It was not classified as a high-hazard industry in the way that construction, mining, and certain manufacturing categories are. The Brazilian Blowout investigations required OSHA to reallocate attention and resources. The air sampling methodology that OSHA investigators used when they visited salons deserves a word. Formaldehyde air sampling is a specialized measurement. It requires trained personnel, calibrated equipment, and sampling protocols that ensure the samples are representative of actual exposures. The standard method involves sorbent tubes or impingers that collect formaldehyde from a measured volume of air, followed by laboratory analysis using high-performance liquid chromatography. The results express formaldehyde concentration in parts per million or parts per billion, and the timing of the sampling, during which phase of the treatment, at what distance from the emission source, over what time period, all affect the result. OSHA investigators sampled during the active treatment phase, which is the phase with the highest formaldehyde release. They sampled at the breathing zone of the Stylist, the space approximately at nose and mouth height where the Stylist would actually be inhaling. The measurements reflected the realistic occupational exposure of the worker, rather than some theoretical maximum or minimum. When those measurements came back as multiples of the permissible exposure limit, they were measuring real conditions in real workplaces. They were not extrapolations or worst-case scenarios. They were what the air contained. The FDA's parallel investigation approached the question from the product side rather than the air quality side. FDA investigators examined the product itself, its formulation, its testing records, its labeling documentation. They requested records from GIBL-LC showing the basis for the formaldehyde-free claim. The records they received were not adequate to support the claim. The testing that had been done either used methodologies that did not detect methylene glycol as formaldehyde, or had not been conducted under conditions that replicated actual use. The fundamental question, what does this product release when it is used as directed, with heat in an enclosed space, had not been rigorously tested before the product went to market. This is, again, the consequence of no pre-market safety review requirement. If the FDA had required GIBL-LC to demonstrate that Brazilian Blowout was safe under realistic use conditions before it reached salons, the air quality data that investigators eventually gathered would have been gathered before a single Stylist was exposed, rather than years into widespread commercial use. The cost of gathering that data proactively, a few $1,000s for a properly conducted exposure study, would have been trivial compared to the regulatory costs, legal costs, and human costs of the enforcement process that followed. The argument against requiring pre-market testing, that it would slow innovation, that it would place a regulatory burden on small companies, that the existing system of post-market enforcement is adequate, is an argument that would be extremely difficult to defend to the stylists who developed occupational asthma during the years the evaluation was pending. Regulatory burden is a real consideration in a competitive market. It is also a consideration that should be weighted against the burden of occupational illness, and the weight of occupational illness falls on people who have less political voice than the industry associations that lobby against regulation. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, which has jurisdiction over some products that the FDA does not, cleaning products for example, has a different regulatory structure that includes mandatory reporting of product-related injuries and illnesses. Cosmetics under FDA jurisdiction do not have a comparable mandatory reporting requirement. A salon owner who experienced multiple stylists developing respiratory symptoms after working with a particular product was not required to report this to any agency. The connection between the product and the symptoms had to be assembled from complaint data, from medical case reports, and from the initiative of individual workers and investigators. There was no automatic signal generation system. The signal eventually arrived through the Oregon complaint, the investigation, the air sampling, the FDA analysis, and the warning letter. The arrival of the signal was not instantaneous, not smooth, not coordinated across agencies in a way that reflected a system designed for this purpose. It was a patchwork of state and federal action, each operating under its own authority and timeline, eventually converging on a common finding. The convergence took approximately 6 years from when the treatment first appeared in significant numbers in American salons to when the FDA warning letter was issued. 6 years is a long time to breathe, something that the system eventually concludes you should not have been breathing. It is not unusually long in the history of occupational chemical safety findings. It is, in some documented cases, quite short. Asbestos-related disease was described in the medical literature in the 1930s, and meaningful regulatory action to limit asbestos exposure in American workplaces was not taken until the 1970s. Compared to that timeline, 6 years is almost responsive. This comparison is not reassuring. It is simply honest about what the history shows about the pace at which occupational chemical hazards are recognised and regulated. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The professional beauty industry did not receive the Brazilian Blowout controversy as a simple health story. It received it as a complicated business story with health elements, and the distinction matters because the response that followed was shaped as much by commercial calculus as by concern for worker safety. The Professional Beauty Association, the trade group representing manufacturers, distributors, and salon owners, responded to the OSHA and FDA investigations with a position that was characteristic of trade associations in these situations: acknowledge the concern, dispute the characterization, emphasize the industry's commitment to safety, and resist the implication that external regulation was necessary or appropriate. The PBA commissioned its own testing of Brazilian-style products. The results, predictably, were more favourable than the government's findings. This is not surprising. Private testing commissioned by interested parties tends toward interested results, not because the scientists conduct themselves fraudulently, but because the questions asked, the conditions tested, and the standards applied are all choices that can be made in ways that favour particular outcomes. What the industry wanted was a path that allowed the smoothing treatment market to continue, corrected the most egregious labelling problems, and avoided either forced reformulation or the kind of mandatory safety requirements that would add cost and complexity to salon operations. What the industry got was something close to that, though it took longer and required more concession than the most optimistic industry observers had hoped. The reformulation question was the most technically interesting one. Could a Brazilian-style smoothing treatment be developed that produced similar results without releasing formaldehyde? This was not a trivial challenge. The formaldehyde chemistry was not incidental to how the treatment worked. It was mechanistically central to the crosslinking that created the smoothing effect. Finding a substitute meant finding a different chemistry that could achieve the same molecular result without the carcinogenic gas. Several companies set about doing exactly this, and over the following years a range of alternative smoothing treatments appeared on the market. Some used glyoxylic acid, which can also cross-link keratin proteins, though the evidence on its safety at high concentrations was less complete than the evidence on formaldehyde, which had been studied extensively precisely because of concerns about it. Others used various combinations of conditioning agents, argan oil, silk proteins, coconut oil, that provided surface smoothing without chemical cross-linking. These were genuinely different products, with gentler effects and shorter duration. They were also marketed using some of the same language: keratin treatment, smoothing treatment, professional blowout, that had been associated with the formaldehyde-based original. The marketplace became confusing, and confusion is, in regulatory terms, a problem. A consumer or stylist trying to evaluate whether a given smoothing product was formaldehyde-free could not rely on the label to answer that question. Labels had already been shown to be unreliable on exactly this point. She would need to either conduct independent chemical testing, which was not practical for individual salons, or rely on third-party certification, which existed but was not universally required, or simply make her best judgment based on available information, which in many cases was the information provided by the product company. The cosmetic safety advocacy community, which had been pushing for stronger FDA oversight for years before the Brazilian Blowout controversy, used the episode as a case study. Organizations including the Environmental Working Group, which maintains the Skin Deep Cosmetics database, and the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics, a coalition of health and environmental advocacy groups, argued that the case demonstrated precisely what happened when cosmetics regulation depended on manufacturer self-policing. Chemical hazards could be mislabeled, worker and consumer exposures could be substantial, and regulatory response could take years to arrive while exposures continued. The Campaign for Safe Cosmetics had been working on cosmetics safety legislation since the mid-2000s. The Safe Cosmetics Act, which had been introduced in Congress in various forms, would have expanded FDA authority to require pre-market safety testing for cosmetic ingredients, created a mandatory ingredient disclosure system, and established a clearinghouse for cosmetic ingredient safety data. The bill had not passed. It had not been close to passing. The cosmetics industry had lobbied against it effectively, and its opponents had found sympathetic audiences in a Congress generally disposed toward skepticism about regulation. The Brazilian blowout controversy renewed interest in the legislation without changing the fundamental political arithmetic that had blocked it. The story was covered, the hearings were held, the advocates testified, the industry testified, and the legislation did not pass. This is again the rhythm of chemical safety policy. The episode, the coverage, the legislative response that does not quite happen, the gradual incomplete administrative improvements that occur instead. What did change, more substantially, was practice in the industry itself, not uniformly and not quickly, but measurably. A significant number of Salon brands discontinued Brazilian Blowout after the controversy. Others switched to formulations that tested lower for formaldehyde. Training programs for cosmetologists began, including more content on chemical safety, ventilation, and the importance of reading material safety datasheets, the technical safety documents that chemical manufacturers are required to produce, and that had existed for Brazilian Blowout throughout the controversy, but had not been communicated to stylists in any systematic way. Material safety data sheets, now called safety data sheets under an updated OSHA standard, are detailed technical documents that describe a chemical's properties, its health hazards, its handling requirements, and its first aid measures. They are produced by manufacturers and are required to be provided to employers who use the chemical. They are not marketing documents. They are technical documents designed for occupational health and safety purposes, and they contain information that labels do not. Specific data on exposure limits, on the health effects of overexposure, on the recommended protective measures. The safety datasheet for Brazilian Blowout Professional Smoothing Solution, as it existed during the years the product was in widespread use, listed formaldehyde under its composition section, despite the label's formaldehyde-free claim. This document was available. It had been available. Employers who received it were, under OSHA's hazard communication standard, required to make it available to their workers and to provide training on the hazards it described. Many salon owners who stocked Brazilian Blowout had received this document and had filed it, or put it in a binder, or given it no particular attention because it was one document among many that arrived with products, because the label said the product was safe, because there had been no compelling reason to read the fine print before someone started measuring the air. In the aftermath of the controversy, OSHA issued updated guidance specifically for the salon industry on chemical hazard communication. The guidance was detailed and practical. It explained which types of products commonly contained formaldehyde, what levels of ventilation were required for various exposure levels, what personal protective equipment should be provided, how to access and interpret safety data sheets. It was made available in multiple languages, reflecting the demographics of the salon workforce, which includes a significant proportion of workers for whom English is not a first language, and for whom English-only safety materials represent an additional accessibility barrier. This guidance existed and was available to any salon that looked for it. Whether salon owners looked for it depended on whether they knew to look, which depended on whether someone had told them the issue was relevant to their business, which in many cases depended on whether they had been reached by the investigation, the trade press coverage, or an enforcement action, or whether they simply happened to employ a stylist who had heard about Oregon and told her boss. Information diffuses through industries the way it diffuses through communities, unevenly, dependent on social networks and institutional channels and individual initiative. The stylist who happened to follow occupational health news, or who had a friend who had followed the Oregon story, or who worked for a salon owner who subscribed to the professional trade publications that covered it, this stylist was more likely to know. The stylist who worked alone, in a small independent salon, who had not heard about Oregon, whose supply distributor had not mentioned anything, whose continuing education credits were focused on colour chemistry and styling techniques rather than occupational health. This stylist was less likely to know. The gap between these two stylists is not a gap in intelligence or conscientiousness. It is a gap in information infrastructure, in the institutional support that translates scientific and regulatory knowledge into practical awareness for people who work in specific occupational settings. Closing this gap is what occupational health systems are supposed to do. It is what the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard is designed to support. The standard was not being followed consistently in the salon industry, partly because enforcement was irregular, partly because the products were labelled as safe, partly because the salon industry had not historically been a focus of intensive occupational health attention. It is attention that determines what gets measured. It is measurement that determines what is known. What is known shapes what is regulated. What is regulated shapes what reaches the worker. The chain has many links. Each link is a place where the transmission can slow or stop or never arrive at all. The air quality in the salon at this moment is a number. The number has a value. No one in the salon knows what the number is. This is true of most numbers that matter most. The Professional Beauty Association's response to the Brazilian Blowout controversy involved several elements that are worth tracing individually, because they illustrate the range of tools available to industry groups navigating a regulatory crisis. The PBA engaged with the FDA and OSHA in the formal comment processes that accompany regulatory actions. It commissioned independent testing of products. It developed guidance for member salons on ventilation and safety practices, and it communicated actively with its members, which included both the manufacturers of the product and the salon owners using it. This is appropriate industry association behaviour. Trade associations exist in part to represent their members' interests in exactly these situations, to ensure that the regulatory process takes industry perspectives into account, to provide members with information and guidance, and to coordinate industry responses to regulatory pressure. The PBA was doing its job. What the PBA's communications tended not to foreground was the possibility that the product had been genuinely misrepresented. The framing that dominated industry communications during the controversy period emphasized the complexity of the chemistry, the uncertainty of the testing methodology, the overreach of the regulatory response, and the steps being taken by responsible manufacturers to address legitimate concerns. It did not emphasize the possibility that the original label was false and that workers had been exposed to a hazard they were not warned about. This framing served commercial interests. It also served a psychological need for the industry, the need to believe that what one has been selling and using has not been causing harm. An industry that had built a profitable product category on a false safety claim had a strong incentive to minimize the implications of that falsity, and the technical complexity of the methylene glycol formaldehyde distinction provided some cover for that minimization. The chemistry was genuinely complex. The distinction was technically arguable, even if the FDA's ultimate position was that it was not a meaningful distinction for safety purposes. A more honest industry response would have acknowledged the failure earlier and more fully, would have proactively reformulated products and communicated the reformulation to the supply chain, and would have supported stronger occupational health standards rather than lobbying against them. This kind of honest response is rare in chemical safety crises, not because the people involved are necessarily dishonest, but because the institutional incentives run strongly against it. Admitting that a product was unsafe is expensive in legal, financial, and reputational terms. Contesting the finding and negotiating a partial resolution is cheaper and more common. The specific lobbying positions the beauty industry maintained during the period when cosmetics safety legislation was being debated are documented in congressional records and in the lobbying disclosure filings that federal law requires. Industry representatives argued that existing law was adequate, that the FDA had sufficient authority under the 1938 Act to address safety problems, that pre-market testing requirements would disproportionately burden small businesses, and that the innovation of the beauty industry depended on regulatory flexibility. These are standard arguments for any industry facing expanded regulatory requirements. What is striking about these arguments in the context of the Brazilian blowout controversy is their timing. The controversy was making news during the same period that cosmetic safety legislation was being debated. The same industry that was fielding regulatory investigations and consumer complaints about the safety of one of its products was simultaneously arguing that existing law was adequate and that additional regulation was unnecessary. These positions are not impossible to hold simultaneously. A company can acknowledge a specific problem while opposing general expansion of regulatory authority, but they are in some tension with each other. The role of product distributors in this story has been under-examined. The chain between manufacturer and salon is mediated by distributors, companies that purchase products from manufacturers and sell them to salons. Distributors are the primary point of contact between most salons and their product supply. They are the people who visit salons, stock the shelves, provide training on new products, and communicate product information. In the Brazilian blowout case, distributors were the link in the chain that should have communicated the Oregon findings to salons, that should have flagged the safety datasheet language, that should have raised the question of whether the formaldehyde-free claim was supported. Some distributors did exactly this, particularly after the Oregon hazard alert became widely known. Others continued to sell the product without flagging the controversy. The distributor's role was not legally well defined with respect to communicating safety information. Distributors were required to make safety datasheets available, but were not required to proactively communicate concerns about products they were distributing. Here again, the regulatory structure placed the burden on the downstream user rather than the upstream supplier. The trade shows where beauty products are introduced, evaluated, and sold represent a significant knowledge transmission channel for the industry. The International Salon and Spa Expo, Cosmoprof, and similar trade shows attract tens of thousands of industry professionals and serve as the primary venue for new product launches, professional education, and peer communication. The Brazilian Blowout controversy was extensively discussed at trade shows from 2010 onward, and the discussions had a direct effect on purchasing decisions and adoption rates. Industry knowledge moves at trade show speed, which is faster than regulatory speed, but slower than exposure speed. Her name was Lisa, and she'd been a hairstylist for 17 years when she noticed that something was wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic way. She was not lying on the floor of the salon unable to breathe, but wrong in the way that chronic illness is wrong, which is a slow wrongness, a gradual accumulation of symptoms that each seem explainable in isolation until the day when you realize you have been explaining them for 3 years and they have not gone away. The cough had started in 2008 or 2009, around the time the salon where she worked began offering Brazilian Blowout. She had attributed it to seasonal allergies, which she had always had, and to the general air quality of a space where products were always being applied and dried and heated. She took over-the-counter allergy medication. The cough persisted. The respiratory symptoms, the tightness in her chest on the worst days, the shortness of breath that surprised her when she climbed stairs, she attributed to not exercising enough, which was true and was also an explanation that her body accepted for longer than it should have. She was 41. These things happen when you are 41. The doctor agreed mostly. He mentioned exercise, mentioned the dry winter air, ordered a chest X-ray that showed nothing obvious. The symptoms continued. What Lisa remembered most clearly, years later, was not the symptoms themselves but the moment she connected them to the product. She had read a brief item in a trade publication about the Oregon OSHA investigation, and something about the description of the symptoms, respiratory irritation, eye burning, headache occurring specifically during or after Brazilian treatment applications, had registered. She had held the magazine for a moment in a specific kind of stillness that happens when you recognize something you've been not quite seeing. She went back to the salon and asked about the products. She found the material safety datasheet in a binder under the reception desk, where it had lived undisturbed since the salon began stocking Brazilian Blowout. She read the section on health hazards. She read the section on exposure limits. She compared what she read to the conditions under which she had been working, and the math was not complicated. She made a workers' compensation claim. This was not straightforward. Occupational illness claims for stylist chemical exposure were not a well-established category in her state. The connection between hair salon work and respiratory symptoms, while documented in occupational medicine literature, was not something the workers' compensation system was set up to evaluate quickly or sympathetically. Her claim was contested. She hired an attorney. The process took 2 years and was resolved in a way she described as partial, some costs covered, a settlement that acknowledged the exposure without requiring the employer to fully acknowledge the harm. Lisa's story is one version. There are others. The occupational health literature from the period documents a range of symptomatic presentations among stylists with significant Brazilian Blowout exposure, acute irritant contact dermatitis from skin contact with the product, occupational asthma developing in stylists with no prior respiratory history, sensitization reactions that made continued work in any chemical environment difficult or impossible. Occupational asthma in particular is a serious condition. Once developed, it often persists even after the causative exposure is removed. A stylist who develops occupational asthma from formaldehyde exposure may find that she can no longer work in a salon, any salon, because other chemicals in the salon environment now trigger reactions. This is not a minor inconvenience, it is a career-ending condition. It is also an irreversible one. The lungs, once sensitized, do not desensitize. The number of stylists who developed occupational asthma attributable to Brazilian blowout is not precisely known, because the data collection that would allow that count was never done. Occupational asthma cases associated with Brazilian blowout appear in the medical literature as case reports and small case series, which is how occupational illness often enters the scientific record, not through large epidemiological studies conducted prospectively, but through clinicians noticing patterns in their patients and writing them up. Several such reports were published in journals of occupational medicine between 2010 and 2015. They describe patients who were healthy before they began using Brazilian blowout, who developed progressive respiratory symptoms during the years of use, and whose symptoms improved when use was discontinued. The kind of temporal relationship that suggests, though does not definitively prove, causation. The difficulty of definitively proving occupational illness causation is one of the structural features of occupational health that makes it persistently difficult to redress. The worker must demonstrate not just that she was exposed, but that the exposure caused her specific illness, in a setting where she may have been exposed to multiple chemicals, where her personal health history is a relevant variable, where the latency between exposure and disease can be years or decades, and where the employer and the product manufacturer both have strong incentives to dispute the causal connection. This is why occupational cancer, for example, is notoriously underdiagnosed and undercompensated. By the time cancer develops, years or decades may have passed since the exposure that contributed to it. The employee may have changed jobs, changed residences, may not be able to document the specific exposures she experienced. The disease has many possible causes, and establishing that any one exposure was the contributing factor is a complex scientific and legal question that the individual worker is rarely equipped to answer alone. For formaldehyde specifically, the established cancer associations, nasopharyngeal cancer and leukemia, typically develop over years of chronic exposure at elevated levels. The stylists who were most heavily exposed to Brazilian blowout in the peak years of 2007 to 2012 are now in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. The latency period for formaldehyde-associated cancers is long enough that any elevated cancer risk in this population would not necessarily be visible in the data yet. This is one of the uncomfortable features of chemical carcinogens. Their worst consequences are deferred, which makes it easier to dismiss concerns in the short term and harder to trace consequences in the long term. None of this is to say that everyone who received or administered a Brazilian blowout treatment will develop cancer. The risk from any given exposure depends on concentration and duration, on individual susceptibility, on many factors that vary across the population. The point is not that exposure was certainly catastrophic. The point is that the women who were exposed were not told what they were being exposed to, were not given the information they would have needed to make an informed decision about accepting that exposure, and were not monitored in any systematic way that would allow the long-term consequences to be understood. Maria, who applied Lisa's treatment in that Seattle salon in 2009, also developed a cough. She attributed it to the commute. Seattle's air quality was never quite what people thought it was. She changed her commute route. The cough continued. She's still doing hair. She's 46 now. She switched salons twice for reasons unrelated to Brazilian blowout, and neither of her subsequent salons offered the original treatment, though both offered successes. She's not unwell in any way she can specifically name. She has a cough in winter. Her eyes are sometimes dry. These are things that happen when you are 46 in February in a city that is mostly grey. She does not think about formaldehyde. The treatment she uses now says, on its label, that it is free of aldehyde. She finds this reassuring. She has no particular reason not to. There is a quiet, specific thing about occupational illness that medical statistics do not fully capture, which is the lived experience of not knowing. Lisa knew eventually because she connected the dots. Most of the women who sat in those chairs or stood beside them did not connect the dots, or connected them too late, or connected them and were told the dots did not connect. The illness that is not recognized as illness is particularly isolating. You carry the symptoms while the world around you continues to offer ordinary explanations, and you accept those explanations because they are available, and because the alternative explanation requires a kind of confrontation that is exhausting and uncertain and expensive. This is the part of the story that is hardest to see from the outside and the most important part to understand. The medical literature on Brazilian blowout exposure begins to accumulate in 2011 and 2012, as physicians who had been treating symptomatic salon workers started publishing their case reports. Case reports are the first stage of the occupational medicine knowledge cycle. An individual physician notices a pattern in patients, connects the pattern to an occupational exposure, and writes it up for a medical journal. These reports are then read by other physicians, who may recognize the pattern in their own patients and add to the literature. Eventually, if the pattern is robust enough, epidemiological studies are designed to test it more rigorously. The case reports that appeared in journals of occupational medicine, pulmonology, and allergy from 2011 onward described a consistent pattern. Salon workers with no prior respiratory history, employed in salons using Brazilian blowout, presenting with progressive respiratory symptoms that improved when use of the product was discontinued. The most serious cases involved occupational asthma, a condition in which repeated exposure to a sensitizing agent causes the airways to become hyperreactive to that agent and potentially to other triggers. Occupational asthma from formaldehyde is a recognized medical entity. It appears in occupational medicine texts as one of the health effects of chronic occupational formaldehyde exposure. The mechanism involves sensitization. The immune system recognizes formaldehyde or formaldehyde protein conjugates as foreign and mounts an inflammatory response that damages the airway tissue over time. Once sensitization occurs, very low concentrations of the sensitizing agent can trigger a response. A worker who has been sensitized to formaldehyde by years of Brazilian blowout exposure may find that ordinary household exposures, cleaning products, pressed wood furniture outgassing, some personal care products, are now sufficient to trigger respiratory symptoms. This is the persistence of occupational illness. It does not end when the exposure ends. The sensitized airways remain sensitized. The capacity for work in any chemically complex environment may be permanently reduced. The affected worker does not recover her previous respiratory function by stopping the exposure. She lives with the changed lungs she developed during the years of exposure, managing symptoms that the exposure created and that belong to her now regardless of whether the product that caused them is still on the market. The legal doctrine of workers' compensation is supposed to address this situation. Workers who develop occupational illness are supposed to receive compensation for medical costs, lost wages, and permanent disability if the illness impairs their ability to work. The reality of occupational illness workers' compensation is more complicated. Claims require documentation of exposure, which may not exist in the informal records of small salon businesses. Claims require medical diagnosis linking the illness to the occupational exposure, which requires a physician trained in occupational medicine, a specialty that is not well distributed across the country and that many workers cannot easily access. The workers most likely to successfully navigate the workers' compensation system for occupational illness claims are workers with strong union representation, workers employed by large businesses with clear occupational exposure records, and workers with access to legal assistance. Independent contractor stylists working in small salons typically have none of these advantages. The path from experiencing symptoms to receiving compensation is long, uncertain, and often not worth attempting without specific legal guidance. Several attorneys who worked on Brazilian blowout cases in the years following the controversy reported that their clients, stylists seeking to document occupational illness claims or participate in class action lawsuits, frequently struggled to establish the exposure documentation that claims required. Salons did not keep records of how many Brazilian treatments were administered on any given day. The products used in any individual salon might have changed over time. The stylist who had been applying treatments for 4 years might not be able to document with any specificity the total number of treatments she had administered or the air quality conditions in the various salons where she had worked. This documentation gap is a structural feature of occupational illness litigation that systematically disadvantages workers. It advantages employers and product manufacturers who can argue that exposure levels are uncertain, that the worker's illness might have developed independently of any occupational exposure, that the connection between the chemical and the disease is not specific enough to establish causation. These arguments are available even when the science on the causation question is relatively clear, because the science describes population-level associations that cannot always be translated into certainty about any individual case. Lisa, from earlier in this story, was one of the workers who navigated this system with partial success. Her experience, the 2-year process, the workers' compensation claim, the eventual settlement that acknowledged the exposure without admitting causation, is more favourable than many workers in her situation experienced. She had documentation. She had worked at a single salon for most of the relevant period, had records of the products used, and had maintained good records of her medical visits. She had an attorney with experience in occupational illness cases. She had enough energy, after the illness, to pursue the claim. Workers who were sicker, more financially precarious, less well documented or less able to sustain the effort of a 2-year legal process did not pursue claims or pursued them unsuccessfully. Their experiences did not enter the legal record or the medical literature. They are among the uncounted in this story, the people who were harmed by a product that told them it was safe, who had no ready mechanism for redress, and who absorbed the consequences in ways that the system that created those consequences was not designed to track or compensate. Formaldehyde deserves a closer look, not because it is dramatic. In the context of this story, it appears as a colourless gas in warm air, which is not dramatically satisfying, but because the way it was talked about during the Brazilian Blowout controversy tells you something useful about how chemical safety debates are conducted, and about what gets lost when the debate replaces the science. Formaldehyde is one of the simplest organic compounds, a carbon atom, 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom, joined in the specific configuration of an aldehyde. It is also ubiquitous. It is produced naturally in small amounts by the human body as a byproduct of metabolism. It is present in the air outdoors, produced by combustion and by the natural decay of organic matter. It outgasses from certain building materials, plywood, particle board, some foam insulations, at levels that can accumulate in poorly ventilated indoor spaces. It is used as a preservative in a wide range of products, including some cosmetics, where it functions as an antimicrobial agent. It is in the smoked food you eat in small quantities. It is in the traffic air you breathe at somewhat higher quantities in certain cities. This ubiquity was used in the Brazilian Blowout controversy and in other formaldehyde safety debates to argue that concerns about the chemical were excessive. If formaldehyde is everywhere, if the body itself produces it, if it occurs naturally in food and air, then surely exposure to it in a salon cannot be cause for alarm. This argument is common in chemical safety disputes and is consistently incorrect in the same way. The relevant question is never whether a substance is present, but at what concentration. Water is present in virtually everything. At sufficient concentrations, it will drown you. The metabolism argument, that the body already handles formaldehyde, therefore additional formaldehyde is not concerning, fails to account for the dose-response relationship that underlies all toxicology. More is different. The body's endogenous formaldehyde is present at carefully regulated concentrations in specific biological contexts. The formaldehyde inhaled during hours of salon treatment use is additional, is reaching different tissues and is at concentrations. The body's endogenous detoxification systems were not designed to continuously process. The carcinogen classification for formaldehyde is Group 1, known human carcinogen, assigned by the International Agency for Research on Cancer in 2004 and reaffirmed since. This classification means that the evidence of cancer causation in humans is sufficient to conclude causation, not just association. It is the strongest classification available. The evidence base includes studies of workers in occupations with high formaldehyde exposure, embalmers, anatomists, wood product workers, who show elevated rates of nasopharyngeal cancer and, at higher exposures, leukemia. Group 1 classification does not mean that any exposure causes cancer with certainty. Carcinogenicity is probabilistic. The risk increases with the concentration and duration of exposure. But a Group 1 carcinogen is one for which the evidence of risk at occupationally relevant levels is established beyond scientific dispute. This is not a frontier of research. It is settled science, the kind that researchers in the field would describe as textbook. The argument that the levels in salons were too low to matter was tested against actual measurements. Oregon OSHA measured 5.35 parts per million during an active treatment. Published research from 2011 through 2015 consistently found concentrations during Brazilian treatment use that exceeded OSHA exposure limits by factors ranging from 2 to more than 10. These are not low-level exposures in poorly understood territory. These are exceedances of standards established specifically to prevent the health effects that are now established in the literature. The industry's methodological counterarguments that the studies had small sample sizes, that the conditions measured were not representative, that the air sampling methodology had limitations, were not entirely without merit, in the technical sense that every study has limitations and small sample sizes do reduce statistical power. But they were arguments made selectively, emphasizing uncertainty where uncertainty existed while not engaging with the larger body of evidence pointing in a consistent direction. This is a feature of science communication in contested chemical safety debates, the argument from uncertainty, deployed as a device for inaction rather than as a genuine epistemological position. What makes the Brazilian Blowout case somewhat unusual in the history of cosmetic chemical safety disputes is that the regulatory response, while slow, was relatively clear. The FDA did send a warning letter. OSHA did conduct investigations and publish findings. Multiple states did take action. The product label was ultimately changed. These are not the outcomes of a fully functional system. A fully functional system would have required pre-market safety testing that would have identified the issue before the product reached the market, but they are more outcomes than some similar situations produced. The formaldehyde-free alternatives that emerged in the market after the controversy represent in some ways genuine progress. Glyoxylic acid-based treatments, while not without their own questions, are not associated with carcinogenesis at the levels present in hair treatments. Treatments using high levels of conditioning agents rather than chemical crosslinkers are gentler still. The market for smoothing treatments has evolved in response to the controversy in ways that, on balance, have reduced exposure to the most serious hazard. But the evolution has been complicated by labeling. The phrase formaldehyde-free remained common on product labels throughout this period, even for products that contained methylene glycol, which the FDA had explicitly stated is the same hazard for practical purposes. A 2012 study by health advocates tested a range of products marketed as formaldehyde-free smoothing treatments and found that a significant proportion released formaldehyde during heat activation at levels that exceeded safety thresholds. The market was not fully cleaned up. It was rearranged, with some genuinely safer products and some products that looked safer and were not. The consumer navigating this landscape was not well equipped to distinguish between them. The ingredients list on a cosmetic product does not necessarily include formaldehyde if the formaldehyde is released during use rather than present as a named ingredient. The International Nomenclature of Cosmetic Ingredient System, which governs how ingredients are named on cosmetic labels, lists methylene glycol and formaldehyde as distinct substances. A product that contains methylene glycol but no formaldehyde as a standalone ingredient can technically, under certain interpretations, claim not to contain formaldehyde, even though the methylene glycol will become formaldehyde during the application process. This technical reality, that what is in the bottle is not necessarily what will reach your lungs, is at the heart of why ingredient list reading is both necessary and insufficient for evaluating Salon chemical safety. An informed consumer can read a label and still not have the information she needs, because the information she needs is not about what the product contains at room temperature, but about what it releases when a flat iron at 450 degrees is applied to it in a small room for 2 hours. This is why the practical guidance that emerged from the controversy, while imperfect, was oriented toward asking specific questions rather than just reading labels. The question is not what is in this product, but what does this product release, and has it been tested for air quality under realistic use conditions and what ventilation is required? Formaldehyde also belongs to a family of preservatives and crosslinkers called formaldehyde releasers, compounds that do not themselves contain formaldehyde, but that slowly release it over time as they degrade. These include quaternium-15, DMDM-hydantoin, diazolidinylurea, imidazolidinylurea, and several others. They appear in a wide range of cosmetic products, not just salon treatments, but everyday moisturizers, shampoos, and conditioners. They are present in products used daily by millions of people who have no reason to associate their shampoo with formaldehyde. The Brazilian Blowout controversy, for all its specificity, opened a window onto a larger question about how formaldehyde and formaldehyde-releasing compounds are present in the cosmetics that people use every day, a question that has been imperfectly answered and imperfectly acted on, The window has been opened. How much light has come through is another matter. The chemistry sits in the bottle sits on the shelf. The shelf is in the back room of the salon next to the colour supplies and the extra towels. No one is thinking about it right now. The afternoon is quiet. The last client of the day is under the dryer. Everything looks exactly like what it is supposed to look like. The specific biology of formaldehyde's carcinogenicity is worth understanding, not because it is alarming in the way that alarm sometimes accompanies cancer discussions, but because it clarifies why certain exposure levels matter and others matter less. Formaldehyde is what is called a direct-acting carcinogen. It does not need to be metabolically activated to cause DNA damage. When formaldehyde enters cells, it can react directly with DNA molecules, forming adducts that, if not repaired, can lead to mutations. The cells most exposed to inhaled formaldehyde are the cells lining the upper respiratory tract, the nose, the throat, the nasopharynx. The nasopharyngeal cancers observed in workers with high formaldehyde exposure are consistent with this biology. Formaldehyde reaches these tissues in high concentrations through inhalation, damages the DNA of the cells lining these spaces, and if the damage accumulates faster than DNA, repair processes can address it. The probability of mutation increases. This is cancer biology at its most mechanistically comprehensible. Not a subtle or indirect pathway, but a direct chemical-to-tissue-to-DNA interaction that follows the same logic as any other chemical carcinogen. The leukemia association with high-level formaldehyde exposure is more mechanistically puzzling and has been the subject of more scientific debate. Leukemia originates in the bone marrow, and it is not immediately obvious how an inhaled gas reaches bone marrow cells. Research over the past 2 decades has provided some mechanistic accounts. Formaldehyde may reach the systemic circulation through the mucous membranes. Formaldehyde adducts have been found in bone marrow cells in exposed workers, and there may be indirect systemic effects from the inflammatory response to high-level respiratory exposure. The leukemia evidence is real, though the mechanism is less completely understood than the nasopharyngeal cancer evidence. What both associations have in common is dose dependence. The elevated cancer risks in occupationally exposed workers were observed at exposure levels sustained over years, typically at concentrations higher than the exposures associated with normal household background levels. This is important because it contextualizes the risk from Brazilian blowout exposure relative to the risk from, say, living in a house with formaldehyde-emitting building materials. The background exposures are real but low, and the evidence suggests that background exposures alone do not meaningfully elevate cancer risk in the general population. The occupational exposures, the embalmers, the anatomists, the stylists doing multiple Brazilian treatments daily, are at the other end of the dose spectrum. Where Brazilian blowout exposures fall in this spectrum is a question that the absence of systematic monitoring makes difficult to answer with precision. The air quality measurements taken during Oregon OSHA and federal OSHA investigations provide data points, but they do not tell us the cumulative lifetime exposure of individual stylists who use the product for years. An estimate can be made. A stylist doing 3 Brazilian treatments daily, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, in a salon with the air quality measured during those investigations would accumulate a substantial formaldehyde dose over a 4-year period. Whether that dose is in the range associated with elevated cancer risk in the occupational literature is a question that exposure models can address in rough terms, but cannot answer with epidemiological certainty without a prospective study of exposed workers. No such prospective study was conducted. The data needed to conduct it were not collected. The registry that would allow researchers to identify the exposed population and track their health outcomes does not exist. This is the scientific consequence of the monitoring gap, not just the practical consequence for individual workers, but the knowledge consequence for public health. We do not know, and now may never know with precision, what the long-term cancer incidence in the Brazilian blowout exposed stylist population looks like, because the infrastructure needed to find out was not built during the years when it would have mattered. Formaldehyde appears in many more consumer products than most people realize, and the Brazilian blowout controversy opened a window onto this broader landscape in ways that have had some lasting effect on consumer awareness. The formaldehyde releases in everyday cosmetics, the quaternium-15 in your shampoo, the DMDM-hydantoin in your conditioner, release formaldehyde slowly as they degrade in the product, providing antimicrobial activity, but also creating a low-level formaldehyde exposure in the liquid phase, and, as products dry on the skin or hair, potentially in the air as well. The concentrations involved in normal household use of cosmetics containing formaldehyde releases are substantially lower than the concentrations measured in Brazilian Blowout salons, and the regulatory status of these preservatives has been maintained partly on the grounds that normal use exposures are well below the levels associated with cancer risk. This assessment is probably correct for most consumers using most products at normal frequencies. It is less clearly correct for people who are already sensitized to formaldehyde, who react to lower concentrations than the general population, and for whom the cumulative exposure from many products with low-level formaldehyde-releasing activity may add up to something meaningful. The European Union's more restrictive approach to formaldehyde in cosmetics, a lower permitted concentration than the United States, explicit restriction of methylene glycol, prohibition of various formaldehyde releases in rinse-off products, reflects a different calibration of the same risk assessment. The scientific data are the same. The risk assessment frameworks and the regulatory philosophy about where to place the burden of proof produce different outcomes in different jurisdictions. A cosmetologist who has understood the Brazilian Blowout story in full is a cosmetologist who has, in a sense, received a condensed education in cosmetic chemistry, occupational exposure assessment, regulatory structure, and the history of chemical safety disputes. She has not necessarily received any of this education in the formal training required for her license. She has received it through the experience of working through a specific crisis in her industry and absorbing the information that crisis produced. This is education through exposure, to the crisis, if not to the chemical. And it is real education, even if it arrived through the hardest possible mechanism. If you're still with me and still drifting, that's exactly where you should be. Subscribe if you'd like more stories like this one waiting for you when you return. To understand why a product could be labelled formaldehyde-free while containing formaldehyde, and why the regulatory system took as long as it did to respond, it helps to understand how cosmetic safety regulation arrived at its current form, which is to say, it helps to understand 1938. The Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938 was itself a response to a catastrophe. In 1937, a pharmaceutical company in Tulsa, Oklahoma, distributed a new formulation of a popular antibiotic, sulfanilamide dissolved in diethylene glycol, a compound related to antifreeze, without testing it for safety in humans. More than 100 people died. The disaster drove Congress to pass the 1938 Act, which substantially strengthened FDA authority over drugs and food. For cosmetics, the 1938 Act was considerably less transformative. It prohibited the sale of adulterated or misbranded cosmetics, required that ingredient lists be accurate, and gave the FDA the authority to pursue cosmetics that caused injury. But it did not require manufacturers to demonstrate that cosmetics were safe before selling them. It did not require FDA approval of cosmetic ingredients. It did not establish a review process for new cosmetic chemicals. It placed the burden of proving harm on the government rather than the burden of proving safety on the manufacturer. This structure has remained essentially unchanged for nearly 90 years. There have been amendments. The colour additive amendments of 1960 created a pre-market approval process for colour additives specifically. The 1938 Act has been updated in various technical ways, but the fundamental architecture has not been disturbed. The cosmetics industry, unlike the pharmaceutical industry, does not require pre-market safety review. The ingredients in your moisturizer have not been evaluated by the FDA for safety before they reached your skin. This is not true in Europe. The European Union's cosmetics regulation, which dates in its current form to 2013, prohibits the use in cosmetics of approximately 1,300 substances that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic to reproduction. The FDA's prohibited and restricted list for cosmetics contains 11 substances. The discrepancy is not because Europe has different chemicals. The same chemicals are available in both markets, but because the regulatory frameworks differ fundamentally in where they place the burden of proof. Formaldehyde is not banned in cosmetics in the United States. It is restricted. It may not be used above 0.2% by weight in leave-on products or 0.1% in rinse-off products, and these restrictions apply to formaldehyde as a named ingredient. They do not explicitly address methylene glycol, which transforms into formaldehyde under heat. The EU prohibits formaldehyde in cosmetics above a much lower threshold and is more explicit about the methylene glycol equivalence. The 1938 regulatory structure has not gone unquestioned. The Safe Cosmetics Act has been introduced in Congress multiple times. The Personal Care Products Safety Act, a bipartisan bill that has had more legislative support, would require the FDA to review at least 5 cosmetic ingredients per year for safety and to mandate company registration and ingredient disclosure. It has not become law. The cosmetics industry's lobbying on these bills is not unusual by the standards of American industry advocacy. Trade associations hire lobbyists, commission research, make arguments about economic impact and regulatory burden, and the sufficiency of existing law. These are legal activities. They are the activities of every industry facing potential new regulation. What is notable in the cosmetics context is that the stakes of inadequate regulation are distributed primarily to workers, particularly salon workers, and to consumers who bear the health consequences, while the commercial benefits of the existing regulatory structure accrue to manufacturers. This distribution of stakes is typical of occupational health situations, where the people making decisions about what chemicals to use are not the same people breathing those chemicals. The salon owner or the product company deciding what to stock is not typically in the salon 8 hours a day. The stylist who is in the salon 8 hours a day typically has limited input into what products are stocked. This gap between decision makers and risk bearers is a structural feature of the occupational health problem that neither labelling reform nor better enforcement alone can fully address. The 1938 Act also predates almost everything currently understood about carcinogenesis, hormone disruption, sensitization, and the long-term effects of cumulative low-level chemical exposures. The concept of a known human carcinogen as defined by IARC did not exist in 1938. The idea that a chemical might be safe at certain doses and hazardous at others, the dose-response relationship that is now fundamental to toxicology, was understood in principle, but not in the operational detail that current science provides. Regulating cosmetics based on a law written in 1938 is, in some respects, like regulating electronic devices based on a law written for telegraphs. Several cosmetic ingredients that are currently legal in the United States have been formally identified as potential carcinogens, reproductive toxins, or endocrine disruptors by various regulatory and scientific bodies. These include coal tar dyes used in some hair colorants, certain UV filters used in sunscreens, some phthalates used as fragrance fixatives, and various formaldehyde releases. Each of these substances has a technical safety argument that can be made for its current regulatory status, and each has a body of scientific literature raising concerns that the regulatory status does not fully address. The fragrance exception is particularly worth understanding. Fragrance is listed as a single ingredient on cosmetics labels, even though a single fragrance formulation may contain dozens of individual chemicals, some of which are known sensitizers, some of which are under investigation for other properties. This is permitted under trade secret provisions. Fragrance formulas are proprietary. A consumer with a fragrance sensitivity reading a product label cannot determine from the label what specific chemicals in the fragrance she might react to. These features of the regulatory landscape, the pre-market approval gap, the fragrance exception, the EU-US ingredient list discrepancy, the methylene glycol classification question, are not secret. They are documented in academic literature, in advocacy reports, in FDA communications, in the proceedings of congressional hearings. They are known to people who spend time in this regulatory space. They are largely unknown to the consumers and workers they most affect. This knowledge gap is not static. It has been shrinking slowly as awareness of cosmetic chemical safety has grown. The Environmental Working Group's Skin Deep database, launched in 2004, allows consumers to look up cosmetic products and see ingredient safety data from various sources. The campaign for safe cosmetics has done sustained public education. A generation of consumers who came of age with the internet has been more willing to research what they put on their bodies than previous generations. The beauty industry itself has responded to market demand for transparency with cleaner beauty lines, ingredient transparency initiatives, and third-party certification programs. These market responses are real improvements. They're also voluntary. dependent on consumer demand in a market where most consumers lack the technical background to fully evaluate ingredient claims, and uneven in their reach across the full range of products and consumers. A consumer willing to spend significant time researching cosmetic ingredients can find substantially more information than was available 20 years ago. A consumer who does not have that time, who works full-time, who has children, who buys products based on price and availability, may have better label information than in 2008, but is still navigating a market in which the default is manufacturer self-certification rather than independent verification. The salon worker navigating this market is not a consumer making a discretionary purchase. She's a worker whose occupational exposure is determined by her employer's product choices and whose protection under the law is supposed to come through the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard, through adequate safety data sheets, through employer training programs, through ventilation requirements. Whether those protections are actually in place depends on whether her employer is aware of the requirements, whether there has been enforcement in her area, whether anyone has told her to read the safety data sheet. The 1938 Act has governed her working conditions indirectly for her entire career. She has never read it, she has no reason to. She is doing hair, which she is good at, and she is trying to get through Tuesday, which is what most of us are trying to do. The law is old, the chemical is known, the gap between them is where the story lives. The 1938 Act's longevity is partly a function of the cosmetics industry's political effectiveness, and partly a function of the general difficulty of passing new legislation in a political system where multiple veto points can block action. But it is also partly a function of the low political salience of cosmetic safety as an issue. Cosmetic safety problems tend to affect women disproportionately, both as workers and as primary consumers, and in a political culture that has historically underweighted women's health concerns relative to other public health priorities, this has meant that the issue has not reliably generated the political energy needed to move legislation. The politics of cosmetic safety reform sit in an interesting place. On one side is the cosmetics industry, which is large, profitable, and politically organized. On the other side is a diffuse coalition of consumer advocates, environmental health organizations, and occupational health advocates, which is smaller and less well-funded. The industry has consistent representation before Congress and before the FDA through trade associations and lobbying firms. The coalition has periodic surges of public attention when a specific controversy generates press coverage, but these surges do not consistently translate into legislative change. The Safe Cosmetics Act and related legislation have attracted more co-sponsors each time they have been introduced, which reflects the growing political attention to the issue, but they have not attracted enough to overcome the hurdles to passage. The Personal Care Products Safety Act, a bipartisan bill that has been introduced with Republican co-sponsorship and that requires a more modest expansion of FDA authority than the Safe Cosmetics Act, has come closer to passage and has served as a vehicle for coalition building. It has not yet become law. What has changed in the regulatory environment since the Brazilian Blowout controversy is partly legislative. California passed the California Safe Cosmetics Act in 2005, which requires cosmetics companies to report to the state any product containing ingredients known to cause cancer or reproductive harm, and partly administrative. The FDA issued draft guidance in 2019 on testing for formaldehyde and formaldehyde-releasing ingredients in cosmetics. OSHA updated its communications to the salon industry. Occupational safety resources for salon workers were made more accessible. The California Safe Cosmetics Program, operating under the state's authority from the 2005 Act, has created a public database of cosmetic products that contain chemicals of concern. This database covers formaldehyde and formaldehyde releases, among many other substances. It is publicly searchable, allowing consumers and workers to look up products by brand and determine whether the manufacturer has reported any chemicals of concern. It is not comprehensive. Reporting is required only for products sold in California, and companies are required to report based on ingredient list rather than on independent testing. But it is more systematic than anything available at the federal level. Washington state enacted a similar law in 2023, and several other states have introduced comparable legislation. The state-level action reflects a pattern common in American regulatory history. States move when the federal government does not, creating a patchwork of regulations that eventually either generates pressure for federal harmonization or creates a de facto national standard as companies reformulate products to meet the most stringent state requirements. The European regulatory model continues to represent a different possible future for American cosmetics regulation. The EU's prohibitions and restrictions list, the requirement for independent safety assessments before new ingredients are used, the transparency requirements for product dossiers, these elements of the EU system produce a cosmetics market where known carcinogens and reproductive toxins are not present in products at the concentrations that were present in Brazilian Blowout during its peak years. European salon workers were also exposed to Brazilian-style treatments, and the controversy occurred in European salons as well as American ones, but the regulatory response was faster and more comprehensive. The EU banned formaldehyde in hair straightening and smoothing products in 2019, explicitly covering methylene glycol as a formaldehyde precursor. This prohibition was based on the same evidence that had been available to American regulators for years, the same IARC carcinogen classification, the same occupational medicine literature, the same air quality measurements from Salon environments. The difference was not in the science. It was in the regulatory framework that decided what to do with the science. The American response has continued to be primarily a post-market enforcement approach. Identify problems after they arise, pursue enforcement actions against the specific violations found, and rely on market and legal pressure to drive broader improvement. This approach has produced real improvements. The Brazilian Blowout products on the market today are substantively different from the products sold in 2009, but it has done so through a process that cost years of unnecessary exposure and has not prevented the underlying structural conditions from persisting. A different regulatory framework, one that required pre-market safety demonstration for cosmetic products and ingredients with known hazard potential, would have caught the Brazilian Blowout chemistry before it reached salons. The EU system would likely have caught it. A pre-market approval system for cosmetics would impose costs and create regulatory burden. Those costs and burdens are real and should be taken seriously in any policy analysis. They are also substantially smaller than the costs imposed on the workers who developed occupational illness during the years when the product was in unrestricted use. The FDA warning letter arrived at GIB LLC in June 2011. It was 11 pages long. It described specific violations of the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. It cited the misbranding provisions. The label claimed formaldehyde-free. The product contained formaldehyde. These facts were incompatible under the law. It asked for a response within 15 working days. It was signed by a division director in the FDA's Office of Cosmetics and Colors. The letter was simultaneously posted to the FDA's website, as all warning letters are, which is how it entered the public domain. Beauty industry trade publications picked it up the same day. The headline in professional beauty trade media was straightforward: FDA sends warning letter to Brazilian Blowout. The headline in general consumer media was, when it appeared at all similarly direct, FDA says popular Salon treatment contains formaldehyde despite label claims. The coverage prompted a specific kind of response in salons across the country. Not panic, the warnings had been building for a year through the OSHA investigations, but a new urgency, a sense that the professional community now had to have a conversation it had been having quietly and needed to have loudly. Professional beauty associations held conference calls. Distributors sent communications to their salon accounts. An industry that had been somewhat divided on the question. Some salons had already moved away from Brazilian Blowout. Others had been waiting for clarity, now had something to respond to. GIB LLC responded to the FDA warning letter with a letter of its own, contesting the agency's characterization of the product chemistry and maintaining that the methylene glycol in the formula was not formaldehyde within the meaning of the law. The company hired regulatory counsel. A back and forth with the FDA ensued over the following months, involving further documentation requests, additional technical arguments, and the slow, procedural machinery of regulatory enforcement. In the meantime, the product continued to be sold. It was reformulated. The company developed versions of the product that it presented as having lower formaldehyde levels, but the original formulation continued to be available in some markets while the regulatory dispute proceeded. This is a feature of FDA enforcement for cosmetics that distinguishes it from pharmaceutical enforcement. There is no automatic market suspension while a dispute is resolved. The burden remains on the agency to prove the violation severe enough to warrant more aggressive action. For consumers and stylists trying to evaluate the safety of the reformulated product, the situation was genuinely confusing. The new formulations were presented as safer. Some of them were tested to be significantly lower in formaldehyde concentration. But testing varied, and the independent testing that had first identified the problem, conducted by California and Oregon regulatory agencies and by private laboratories, was not automatically conducted on the new formulations as they appeared. The market moved faster than the testing infrastructure. Several class action lawsuits filed in 2011 and 2012 moved through the courts during this period. The class actions named GIB LLC and, in some cases, salon owners who had continued to use the product after the warnings became public. The lawsuits allege consumer fraud, product liability, and various other theories of recovery. They were consolidated in federal court in the Central District of California. In 2012, GIB LLC reached a settlement with the Federal Trade Commission over advertising claims. The FTC settlement required the company to substantiate any future safety or health claims with competent and reliable scientific evidence, which is the standard all advertisers are held to under FTC law, but which had clearly not been met in this case. The settlement did not include an admission of wrongdoing. It included a payment that was not disclosed in the public versions of the settlement documents. State attorneys general from California, Connecticut, and other states reached parallel settlements with GIB LLC, requiring changes to labeling and marketing practices within their states. These settlements, taken together, represented a significant regulatory outcome for a cosmetic product. Enforcement actions from the FDA, OSHA, FTC, and multiple state AGs is not a routine outcome. It reflects the seriousness of the specific violations identified. The product's market position was damaged but not destroyed. Brazilian Blowout continued to be sold, with reformulated products that the company maintained were safe under current scientific understanding. The salon market for smoothing treatments continued to grow, supplied by a proliferating range of products from various manufacturers. Some of these products used the same active chemistry, labeled differently. Some used genuinely different chemistry. The consumer trying to navigate the market could not reliably distinguish between them from the label alone. What changed most substantially in the aftermath of the warning letter was professional awareness. By 2013, a cosmetologist receiving training in the United States was significantly more likely to have heard about the Brazilian Blowout controversy than her counterpart in 2009, and was more likely to have received some instruction about chemical safety, ventilation, and the importance of ingredient evaluation. This is progress, and it is real, even if it arrived through the slow and expensive mechanism of a major public controversy rather than through a proactive educational infrastructure. The National Healthy Nail and Beauty Salon Alliance, a worker advocacy organization based in California, worked during this period to document health concerns among salon workers and to advocate for better occupational health protections. The alliance was particularly focused on nail salon workers, a population even more poorly studied than hair stylists in terms of occupational chemical exposure. But its work on the Brazilian Blowout controversy contributed to a broader conversation about the occupational health of beauty service workers as a class. That broader conversation identified a cluster of characteristics that make beauty salon workers particularly vulnerable to occupational chemical exposure: the prevalence of self-employment or employment in small businesses, which reduces access to the occupational health infrastructure available to workers in larger enterprises; the high proportion of immigrant workers in some segments of the industry who may face language barriers to safety information; the gendered nature of the workforce in a culture that has historically taken women's occupational health concerns less seriously than men's; the physical informality of salon spaces, which are retail environments first and workplaces second, without the safety engineering that industrial workplaces require. These vulnerabilities did not disappear after the Brazilian Blowout controversy. They remained structural features of the industry. The controversy produced incremental improvements: better labeling practices for some products, more occupational health content in some training programs, more vigilance among some distributors and salon owners, without addressing the underlying structural conditions that had allowed the exposure to occur in the first place. A cosmetologist starting her career in 2015 was better protected than one starting in 2008. in the specific sense that the worst Brazilian Blowout formulations were no longer being marketed with false safety claims, and professional awareness of chemical hazards was higher than it had been. She was not protected in any comprehensive way. The regulatory framework governing her workplace was still the framework that had existed in 1938, still lacking pre-market safety testing, still dependent on post-market enforcement, still structured to place the burden of proof on regulators rather than manufacturers. The FDA warning letter had done what warning letters do. It had forced a company to respond to a specific identified violation, and the response had produced specific changes to a specific product. It had not changed the conditions under which the next product would enter the market or the next after that. Those conditions were the same as before. The law had not changed, the regulatory framework had not changed, the incentive structure for manufacturers had not fundamentally changed. What had changed was knowledge. More people knew more about what was in Salon products. More people knew that labels could be incomplete or misleading. More people knew that they had the right to ask questions. This is not nothing. In the long history of chemical safety, a significant portion of what improvement has occurred has come through exactly this mechanism: the widening of knowledge, the normalization of questioning, the gradual building of the expectation that safety information should be available and should be accurate. The salon is empty now. The last client left at 5:30. The blow dryers are switched off and their absence leaves a particular quality of quiet. Someone has stacked the clean towels. Someone has wiped down the stations. The bottles sit in their rows on the shelves, some familiar, some new reformulations, some products from companies that entered the market after Brazilian Blowout made smoothing treatments famous and then made them controversial. The labels all say they are safe. Most of them are. The ones that are not will eventually be identified, and the identification will take longer than it should, and the people closest to the products will bear the consequences of that interval. This is the pattern. It has repeated before. It will repeat again. Knowing the pattern does not stop the pattern, but it does change what you can see when you are standing inside it. The class action settlements that resulted from the Brazilian Blowout litigation are public documents, at least in part, and they tell a story about how legal redress for product liability claims works in the American system. The consumer class action, the case brought on behalf of clients who received the treatment, was settled for amounts that provided modest recovery for class members who filed claims. The settlement process required class members to document their exposure, submit claims, and wait through the lengthy administration of the settlement fund. Many class members, for reasons of time, awareness, and documentation challenges, did not file claims. The worker cases were legally distinct. Stylists who developed occupational illness could pursue workers' compensation claims, individual tort claims, or participate in class actions depending on their specific circumstances and state law. The legal pathways were multiple, but none were easy. Workers who ultimately received some compensation did so through a process that was measured in years and required legal representation that was not universally accessible. The class action mechanism is, in the American legal system, the primary vehicle for aggregate redress of consumer and worker harms from defective products. It allows individuals whose individual claims might not be large enough to justify independent litigation to pool their resources and share the cost of a legal challenge. It is imperfect in many ways. Settlement amounts are often lower than full compensation. The attorney's fees are substantial. The process is slow. But it is what exists for addressing the widespread product harms that no individual has sufficient resources to address alone. GIB LLC, the company at the center of the controversy, underwent significant business changes in the years following the warning letter and settlements. The company continued to exist and continued to sell Brazilian Blowout products under reformulated formulas. It also expanded its product line into other areas of professional hair care. Whether the episode meaningfully changed the company's approach to safety testing and label accuracy is difficult to assess from outside. The public record shows compliance with the settlement requirements and label changes, and does not show subsequent major regulatory actions of the same kind. The reformulated products that replaced the original Brazilian Blowout professional smoothing solution were tested by the company and by independent laboratories, and were found to contain formaldehyde at substantially lower concentrations than the original. The new formulations used a lower ratio of methylene glycol, resulting in lower formaldehyde release during heat application. This was a genuine improvement, though the extent of the improvement varied across different formulations, and the question of what formaldehyde release was acceptable, as opposed to merely lower than before, remained contested. The salon industry's approach to Brazilian-style treatments in the aftermath of the controversy can be characterized as cautious adoption of reformulated products, continued use of alternative smoothing treatments, and increased attention to ventilation and safety practices in those salons that continue to offer smoothing services. This is a reasonable description of how an industry responds to a product safety crisis that does not result in an outright market ban. Some actors leave the category, some continue with modifications, and the market settles at a new equilibrium that is better than the original, but not necessarily ideal. The National Cosmetology Association and other professional organizations developed more robust safety guidance for their members in the aftermath of the controversy. The guidance covered not just Brazilian Blowout, but chemical safety in salons more broadly, ventilation requirements, personal protective equipment for various chemical categories, how to read safety data sheets, what rights workers have under the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard. This guidance was more comprehensive than anything the industry had produced before the controversy, and it reached professional members through the same trade channels that had been used to promote the original product. The continuing education requirements for cosmetologist licensure did not uniformly include chemical safety content even after the controversy, because cosmetology licensing is regulated at the state level and the content requirements vary by state. Some states updated their curricula to include more occupational health content. Others did not. A cosmetologist licensed in 2016 might have received significantly different occupational health training depending on which state she was licensed in. The broader point about continuing education is worth dwelling on. Chemical safety is not static knowledge. New products enter the market. The regulatory status of existing chemicals changes as new research accumulates. New evidence on the health effects of occupational exposures becomes available. A system in which cosmetologists receive their initial safety training once and are not systematically updated as the knowledge base evolves is a system that will always lag behind the chemicals in use in the field. The Professional Beauty Association did eventually develop a voluntary product safety program that encouraged manufacturers to have their products tested by independent laboratories and to make the results available. Participation in the program was voluntary and not all manufacturers participated. The program represents an improvement in the infrastructure of market self-regulation, even if it does not provide the same assurance as mandatory pre-market testing under regulatory authority. Smoothing treatments did not go away after 2011. They evolved. The market adapted with the particular efficiency that markets demonstrate when consumer demand is strong, and the obstacle to be worked around is a regulatory finding rather than a disappearing need. Women still wanted what the treatments offered. Salons still needed profitable service offerings. The question was not whether smoothing treatments would continue, but what form they would take, and whether the new forms would be safer. The glyoxylic acid treatments that emerged in the years after the Brazilian Blowout controversy were presented as the clean chemistry alternative, the formaldehyde-free option that actually was formaldehyde-free, or at least formaldehyde-releasing ingredient-free, which was not quite the same thing but was close enough for the marketing purposes at hand. Glyoxylic acid is an alpha-hydroxy acid, chemically related to glycolic acid. It can cross-link keratin proteins, though through a different mechanism than formaldehyde, and it produces smoothing effects that last for several months. It does not release formaldehyde in use. This was genuinely good news for anyone concerned about formaldehyde specifically. Glyoxylic acid has a different risk profile than formaldehyde. It is not classified as a carcinogen. The evidence base for its long-term safety at salon-relevant exposures is thinner than for formaldehyde, but this reflects the shorter time it has been in use rather than a specific identified hazard. A stylist using glyoxylic acid-based treatments is not being exposed to a known carcinogen in the way she was with Brazilian Blowout. This is an improvement. The glyoxylic acid treatments are, however, acidic. pH values in some formulations are quite low, comparable to the pH of vinegar or lemon juice. At low pH, repeated skin contact can cause irritation and, over time, sensitization. Some stylists who switched from Brazilian Blowout to glyoxylic acid treatments found that the new treatments caused their own set of occupational skin concerns. The hazard profile had changed. It had not disappeared. A parallel development in the market was the proliferation of what came to be called keratin treatments in the generic sense. Products marketed under the Keratin umbrella that varied enormously in their actual composition. Some contained glyoxylic acid, some contained other cross-linking agents, some contained formaldehyde at lower but not negligible concentrations, relabeled under various chemical synonyms, or listed in ways that the average consumer or even the average cosmetologist could not easily identify. Some contained primarily conditioning agents with no cross-linking chemistry at all, producing gentler, shorter duration effects that were marketed with the same vocabulary as the more aggressive treatments. The lack of standardized terminology was a problem that the Brazilian Blowout controversy had identified but had not solved. Keratin treatment, Brazilian Blowout, smoothing treatment, professional blowout. These terms had no regulated definitions. Any manufacturer could use any of them for any product. A consumer or salon owner choosing between two products labeled as keratin treatments could not determine from the label what the chemical basis of the treatment was, what specific cross-linkers it contained, or how it compared to other products with similar names. Industry attempts at self-certification emerged during this period. Several third-party organizations offered to certify products as genuinely formaldehyde-free, and some manufacturers sought these certifications as a market differentiator. These certifications varied in their rigor. Some required comprehensive testing under realistic use conditions, some relied on ingredient declaration without testing, some existed primarily as marketing tools. A consumer trying to navigate the certification landscape faced the same problem she faced with ingredient labels. The information existed in principle, but the expertise needed to evaluate it was specialized. The nail salon industry was undergoing its own chemical safety reckoning during this period, driven partly by the Brazilian Blowout controversy and partly by independent reporting. A 2015 New York Times investigation documented the health effects of chemical exposure among nail salon workers, a population heavily immigrant, predominantly female, working in close contact with solvents, adhesives, and resins for long hours in spaces with variable ventilation. The investigation prompted a response from the New York Governor's Office that resulted in new regulations for nail salons in the state. The nail salon investigation and the Brazilian Blowout controversy together created a brief moment of heightened public attention to occupational chemical safety in the beauty industry. Congressional hearings were held. Advocates testified. Proposals for expanded FDA authority were discussed. The moment did not produce major federal legislative change. It produced some state-level action, some industry self-regulatory initiatives, some increased media attention to the issue. It produced awareness, which is the most durable thing public controversy tends to produce, and the least structurally transformative. The awareness had real effects at the individual level. Stylists who had heard about the controversy were more likely to ask questions about the products they used. Salon owners who had been through a difficult period of uncertainty were more likely to evaluate new products more carefully, to read safety data sheets, to ensure adequate ventilation. The next generation of cosmetology students received more occupational health education than the generation before them, in part because the controversy had made it visible as a necessary topic. At the same time, the industry continued to grow. The Bureau of Labor Statistics counted approximately 660,000 hairdressers, hairstylists, and cosmetologists in the United States as of 2010. By 2020, the number had grown to over 700,000. Nail technicians numbered more than 400,000. These workers handled chemical products daily, in workplaces that range from large salons with modern ventilation systems to small independent operations with open windows as their primary air exchange. The regulatory structure governing their chemical exposures had improved marginally at the margins. It had not transformed. A specific product can be regulated, a specific claim can be forced off a label, a specific company can be sanctioned. What is harder is changing the background conditions, the regulatory framework, the training infrastructure, the occupational health culture, that determine how the next product will be evaluated before the next problem develops. The next problem will develop. This is not pessimism, it is pattern recognition. In the history of cosmetic and occupational chemical safety, the discovery of hazards in products already in widespread use is not an anomaly. It is a recurring event. The pattern goes: product enters market, product is adopted, concerns emerge, investigation occurs, regulatory response arrives, the worst problems are addressed, the market adapts, and a new product enters the market through the same inadequately regulated door. The women in those salons, the clients, the stylists, the salon owners, are not passive in this pattern. They respond to information when they have it. They make better choices when better choices are visible. What they cannot do is manufacture the institutional infrastructure that would make the information available before they need to respond to it. That infrastructure is what regulation is supposed to provide. Building it, and funding it, and using it is a choice that communities make through their political institutions. The Brazilian Blowout controversy was a moment when that choice was visible. The choice was made in the years that followed at state and federal levels in ways that produced incremental improvement and did not produce transformation. This is the most common outcome of occupational chemical safety crises. It is also the most likely outcome of the next one. The smoothing treatments in salons today are, in most cases, safer than what was being used in 2009. This is real. The women applying them and receiving them in 2024 are, on average, less exposed to the specific hazard that drove the controversy than their counterparts 15 years ago. The system worked, partially after the fact in the imperfect way that the current system works. The question that the pattern keeps raising, the question that the stylists who developed respiratory symptoms in 2009 and 2010 were raising with their bodies before they had words for it, is whether partially and after the fact is an acceptable standard for the protection of workers who are in the room every day. The room is there, the products are there, the workers are there. The question is old. The pattern knows the answer. It has given the same answer, in slightly different form many times before. The glyoxylic acid treatments that emerged as the primary alternative to formaldehyde-based smoothing deserve more examination than they typically receive, because the narrative of a clean replacement obscures some genuine complexity. Glyoxylic acid, while not a known carcinogen, is a compound with its own occupational health considerations. At the pH levels used in smoothing treatments, which are quite low, sometimes pH 3 or below, glyoxylic acid solutions are corrosive. Repeated skin contact can cause irritation and sensitization. Occupational dermatitis from acidic hair treatment products is a recognized clinical entity. The Brazilian Smoothing Treatment Association, a trade group that formed partly in response to the Brazilian Blowout controversy to represent the interests of the broader category, commissioned studies on glyoxylic acid-based products that found lower health risk profiles than the formaldehyde-based original. These studies were conducted and their findings were communicated to the industry as evidence that the transition to glyoxylic acid represented a genuine safety improvement. The studies were correct in the narrow sense that glyoxylic acid is not a carcinogen. They were less comprehensive in their assessment of the full occupational health profile of the new products. A stylist who experienced skin irritation or sensitization from glyoxylic acid-based products in 2013 was in a somewhat different position than a stylist who had experienced respiratory symptoms from Brazilian Blowout in 2009, in that the recognition of the hazard came more quickly. Dermatitis is visible and acute in ways that respiratory sensitization is not, and the products involved were not operating under a false safety label. But the dermatitis was still a consequence of inadequate hazard communication and inadequate protective practices, and the workers experiencing it were still in the position of discovering the hazard through their own bodies. The hair smoothing market in the mid-2000s also saw the emergence of a category of products marketed as natural or organic smoothing treatments. These products use conditioning agents derived from plant sources, coconut oil, argan oil, various plant proteins, combined with heat application to produce temporary smoothing effects. The effects were gentler and shorter lasting than the formaldehyde-based original, but the products were positioned to appeal to consumers who are now sensitized to chemical safety concerns in the category. The marketing of these products as natural created its own set of complications. Natural ingredients are not inherently safe. Arsenic is natural, as toxicologists are fond of noting, and some of the plant-derived ingredients used in natural smoothing treatments have their own sensitization potential or other concerns. The word natural on a beauty product label carries no regulatory definition and no safety implication. It is a marketing term that exploits a reasonable consumer assumption that natural means safe, without bearing any regulatory obligation to support that assumption. The proliferation of product categories in the smoothing treatment market following the controversy reflects a general pattern in the cosmetics market. When a specific ingredient becomes controversial, the market generates alternatives that are positioned as superior on the specific axis of concern, even when the alternatives may have different issues. Consumers who are specifically concerned about formaldehyde find products labeled formaldehyde-free. Consumers who are more broadly concerned about chemical safety find products labeled natural. The options appear to address the concern. Whether they do so adequately depends on factors that the labels do not provide. One development in the aftermath of the controversy that has had lasting positive effects is the growth of the clean beauty movement, which emerged as a broader cultural response to concerns about cosmetic chemical safety, of which the Brazilian Blowout episode was a prominent example. The clean beauty movement advocates for transparency in cosmetic ingredient disclosure, the avoidance of certain chemical categories, and higher standards for safety testing. The movement is imperfectly defined and sometimes scientifically questionable in its specific claims, but it has created market pressure for ingredient transparency that has driven real improvements in product labeling and formulation. Large retailers, Sephora, Target, Ulta, and others, have developed their own clean beauty standards that include formaldehyde and formaldehyde releases on their restricted ingredient lists. Products that meet these standards are marked in stores and online. The retailer standards are private and voluntary, and they vary across retailers, but their aggregate effect on the market has been substantial. Manufacturers who want shelf space at major retailers have an incentive to formulate without the restricted ingredients. This market pressure has driven reformulation of many products in the category more quickly than any regulatory mandate would have. The retailer standards represent an interesting model for achieving product safety outcomes outside the formal regulatory structure. They work because large retailers have leverage over manufacturers. If you want your product on our shelves, it needs to meet our standards. And because the standards, though private, are publicly communicated and subject to consumer scrutiny. The limitations of this model are also apparent. It applies primarily to products sold through the major retail chains, not to professional products distributed directly to salons, and it depends on the retailer's standards being rigorously defined and enforced. The salon industry's professional products, the products most closely associated with the Brazilian Blowout controversy, the products administered to clients by professional stylists, are not primarily distributed through the retail channels where clean beauty standards have had their greatest effect. Professional products reach salons through specialized distributors and trade channels. The standards that apply to those products are the FDA's standards, which we have already seen in some detail, and the OSHA hazard communication standards. The clean beauty movement has been slower to penetrate the professional channel than the consumer retail channel, which means that the workers most exposed to professional chemical products have been less protected by market pressure than the consumers buying products off retail shelves. By now you have spent some time inside the chemical safety story of the salon world, and if there is something useful to carry away from it, something practical and specific that changes what you see when you walk into a salon, it is probably this. The label is a starting point, not a conclusion. It is the beginning of a conversation you're entitled to have, not the end of it. The practical guide to evaluating salon chemical products starts before the label, with an understanding of what kind of product is being used. Smoothing treatments, whether called Brazilian Blowout, Keratin treatment, professional smoothing, or any other variation, have historically been in a different chemical category than shampoo or conditioner. They involve cross-linking chemistry, which produces the smoothing effect but also carries specific risks depending on which crosslinker is used. Understanding that you are in a different category of product is the first step. The second step is understanding which ingredients to look for. Formaldehyde can appear on a cosmetic ingredient list under several names. Formaldehyde is the simplest and clearest. Methylene glycol, as has been established at length, is formaldehyde in aqueous solution. The FDA has stated this explicitly, and a product containing methylene glycol will release formaldehyde when heated. Formalin is a trade name for formaldehyde in solution. Methanediol is another synonym. Methylene oxide, paraformaldehyde, oxymethylene, and oxymethane are additional chemical names for formaldehyde or closely related species. If any of these appear on an ingredient list for a smoothing treatment, the product contains formaldehyde in a form that will be released during application. The formaldehyde releases, ingredients that do not themselves contain formaldehyde but that release it slowly as they degrade, are a broader category. Quaternium-15 is one of the most potent formaldehyde releases and one of the most common preservatives in cosmetics. DMDM-hydantoin, diazolidinylurea, imidazolidinylurea, and polyoxymethylene are others. These are not typically present in smoothing treatments at high concentrations, but they appear in a wide range of everyday cosmetic products, shampoos, conditioners, moisturizers, some makeup. And for individuals with formaldehyde sensitivity, their cumulative presence across multiple products can be relevant. Glyoxylic acid, the primary alternative crosslinker in post-Brazilian blowout smoothing treatments, appears on ingredient lists as glyoxylic acid or as ethanol 2,1-hydroxy, or similar systematic chemical names. It does not release formaldehyde. Its presence in a smoothing treatment is an indication that the product is using a different cross-linking mechanism, though it is not a guarantee of safety in all other respects. The ventilation question matters at least as much as the ingredient question. A salon that uses genuinely formaldehyde-free smoothing products in a poorly ventilated space still creates a chemical environment that is more demanding on respiratory health than a well-ventilated space. Glyoxylic acid at high concentrations produces an acidic aerosol under the flat iron that can irritate the airways. The general principle, adequate ventilation for any chemical-intensive process, applies regardless of which specific chemicals are in use. The question you're entitled to ask in any salon offering a smoothing treatment is, can you show me the safety data sheet for this product? This is a reasonable question. It is a question that salon workers are entitled to ask their employers under OSHA law, and that consumers can ask as well, though the legal framework protecting consumer access to this information is less robust than the worker framework. A salon that cannot or will not produce a safety data sheet for a product being applied to your hair is a salon operating with less transparency than you're entitled to. Safety data sheets for cosmetic products are available from manufacturers, from distributors, and often from online databases. The Skin Deep database maintained by the Environmental Working Group does not provide safety data sheets, but it does rate cosmetic products based on ingredient safety data and links to relevant information. Looking up a product on Skin Deep before a salon appointment takes approximately 3 minutes and can surface concerns that would not be apparent from the product label. The specific section of a safety data sheet most relevant for salon treatments is Section 2, Hazard Identification, and Section 8, Exposure Controls and Personal Protection. Section 2 will list the health hazards associated with the product's components. Section 8 will describe what engineering controls, ventilation requirements, and personal protective equipment, gloves, respirators, are recommended for safe use. If Section 8 recommends respiratory protection for the worker applying the product, that is information relevant to your own presence in the room during application. A salon stylist wearing respiratory protection, a fitted respirator, not a surgical mask which does not filter chemical vapors, while applying a smoothing treatment is telling you something about what the product contains and how the salon has assessed the risk. The respirator is evidence of appropriate hazard recognition. Its absence does not mean the product is safe. It may mean the product genuinely does not require respiratory protection, or it may mean that the hazard has not been assessed adequately. Context and the other information available, the safety data sheet, the ingredient list, the ventilation quality, help you evaluate which. Window ventilation is a proxy measure you can assess without any specialized knowledge. A salon room where smoothing treatments are applied should have active air exchange, meaning air is moving through the space, not just recirculating within it. An open window in the same room is better than an open window in an adjacent room. Dedicated ventilation at the height where the flat iron is operating, low, near the client's head, is more effective than ceiling ventilation only. A salon where the windows are closed and the only ventilation is recirculating HVAC is a salon that has not addressed the air quality implications of the treatment it is offering. You can ask about this. Asking is allowed. What kind of ventilation do you have? Is this room dedicated to smoothing treatments, or are they done throughout the salon? These are questions a stylist or salon owner should be able to answer. The inability to answer them is itself information. The timing question is relevant as well. Formaldehyde and other volatile compounds are released most intensively during the flat iron phase of smoothing treatment application. If you are a client accompanying someone to a treatment, or a client who's receiving a different service in the same salon on the same day, your exposure is lower than the person receiving the treatment, but not zero. The chemicals released during one treatment diffuse through the salon air. The length of time you spend in that air and its ventilation quality are the variables that matter. For stylists, the picture is different and the stakes are higher. A stylist doing Brazilian or Glyoxylic acid treatments multiple times daily, 5 days a week, for several years, is accumulating an occupational exposure that her body is not warned about and that her employer may not have adequately assessed. The OSHA Hazard Communication Standard gives her specific rights: the right to be trained about the chemicals she works with, the right to access safety data sheets, the right to know the occupational exposure limits for those chemicals, the right to have her workplace evaluated and controlled for chemical hazards. These rights exist on paper. They exist in regulation. Whether they translate into practice in any specific salon depends on whether the employer is aware of the obligations, whether there has been enforcement in that jurisdiction, and whether the stylist herself knows enough about her rights to invoke them. Knowing those rights exist is a precondition for being able to exercise them. The broader pattern of workers in the beauty industry carrying chemical exposures without adequate information or protection has been documented clearly enough that it can now be described without sensationalism. It is a structural occupational health problem. It disproportionately affects women and immigrant workers. It has been improving incrementally since the Brazilian Blowout controversy increased public awareness, and it has not been resolved. What you can do with this information, in the immediate practical sense, is modest. You can read labels more carefully, you can ask questions in salons, you can look up products on the databases that aggregate ingredient safety data. You can choose where you have alternatives, products and salons that have invested in transparency and safer chemistry. You can support, in whatever way fits your circumstances, the legislative and regulatory efforts to improve cosmetic safety law. These are small actions in the context of a systemic problem. They are also the actions available to the individual. Systemic problems are addressed by many people, taking small actions consistently over time, and by the cumulative pressure those actions create on institutions that are capable of change but do not change without it. The salon still smells like warm air and product. You know more about what that smell contains than you did an hour ago. The knowledge is not alarming. It is in the end knowledge about chemistry and regulation, and the people who navigate both. It is the kind of knowledge that is most useful when it becomes ordinary, when asking for a safety data sheet feels as natural as asking about the price, when knowing your rights in a workplace feels as normal as knowing the hours. The practical guide to safer salon visits extends beyond the smoothing treatment context to the general question of how to be an informed consumer of salon services. Hair colouring products are among the most heavily used chemicals in salon environments, and they carry their own profile of occupational and consumer health concerns. Permanent hair dyes use an oxidative process involving hydrogen peroxide and paraphenylenediamine, commonly abbreviated PPD, which is one of the most potent contact allergens known. PPD sensitization is common among hairdressers. Studies have found rates of PPD allergy ranging from 15 to 30% in professional stylists, and once sensitized, an individual may react to PPD in contexts far beyond hair color, including temporary tattoos and some rubbers and pharmaceutical compounds. The patch test recommendation that hair color manufacturers include in their professional and consumer products is not marketing boilerplate. It is the appropriate precaution for a product containing a significant contact allergen. A patch test involves applying a small amount of the product to the skin behind the ear or on the inner arm 48 hours before full use and checking for a reaction. Stylists who perform multiple color services daily do not consistently patch test themselves because they are not applying the product to their own skin in the same way clients do, but they are exposed through contact with clients' hair during processing, and their cumulative skin exposure over years can produce sensitization. Nail salons represent a distinct chemical environment with its own set of occupational health concerns that are in some ways more complex than the hair salon context. The chemicals used in nail services, acrylates in gel and acrylic nail products, solvents in nail polish and nail polish remover, adhesives and primers used in nail enhancements, are a chemically diverse set with multiple hazard categories. methyl methacrylate, which was the standard monomer in acrylic nail products until it was restricted by the FDA in the 1970s due to nail damage and sensitization concerns, was replaced by ethyl methacrylate, which has a lower but non-zero sensitization potential. The UV-cured gel products that have become dominant in nail services since the 2000s involve acrylate monomers with their own sensitization concerns. A 2020 study in the British Journal of Dermatology found a significant increase in acrylate sensitization among patients presenting with allergic contact dermatitis and identified gel nail products and nail technician occupational exposure as primary sources. The study's findings were consistent with the pattern established by the Brazilian Blowout controversy, a chemical category in widespread use, with known sensitization potential, creating a growing burden of occupational and consumer illness that was not being systematically tracked or adequately regulated. Ventilation remains the most reliable general protective measure across all salon chemical categories. Whether the chemical concern is formaldehyde from smoothing treatments, PPD from hair color, acrylate vapors from nail products, or acetone from nail polish remover, adequate ventilation reduces exposure by diluting or removing chemical vapors from the breathing zone. The specific ventilation design that is adequate varies with the chemical. Formaldehyde requires air exchange rates appropriate for its volatility and toxicity. Acetone requires different rates for different concentrations. But the general principle of dilution ventilation is universally applicable. A salon that has invested in adequate ventilation for its chemical processes is demonstrating something about its approach to worker and client safety. Ventilation is not cheap. A well-designed local exhaust ventilation system for a nail salon, for example, might cost several $1,000s to install, and the investment reflects a decision to spend money on safety rather than elsewhere. In a business context where margins are often thin, this decision is not trivial. A salon that has made it is telling you something about its priorities. The specific questions to ask in any salon include: what products are being used today? Are there safety data sheets available? What is the ventilation system, and when was it last evaluated? Are stylists provided with appropriate personal protective equipment? These are questions that most salon visitors do not ask and most salon workers are not asked. Making them normal, making it ordinary to ask about the safety of the chemicals being used in a space you are spending time in, is part of what changes the culture around these issues. The online tools available for researching salon products have improved substantially since the Brazilian Blowout controversy. The Environmental Working Group's Skin Deep database now contains entries for most commercially available cosmetic products and rates them on a scale from 1 to 10 based on the hazard profiles of their ingredients. The ratings are not perfect. They rely on manufacturer ingredient disclosure, which can be incomplete, and the scoring methodology has been criticized by some toxicologists as inconsistent. But they provide a first-order filter that is useful for identifying products with known concerning ingredients. The Good Face Project, the Think Dirty app, and similar consumer tools offer alternative ingredient evaluation frameworks. None of them is authoritative, and they sometimes disagree with each other, which reflects genuine scientific uncertainty in some cases and methodological differences in others. What they share is the ambition of making cosmetic ingredient safety information accessible to consumers who do not have chemistry backgrounds, and in this they have succeeded in important ways. A consumer who uses these tools regularly develops a working vocabulary for cosmetic ingredient safety that is far better than what was available to consumers in 2005. The question of what to do with this knowledge in the moment, in the salon chair in the middle of an appointment, is different from the question of how to do advanced research. In the moment, the most practical things are to ask about ventilation if you are receiving a chemical treatment, to note whether the room seems well ventilated or closed and stagnant, to pay attention to your own physical responses during the appointment, and mention them if they are uncomfortable. These are simple observations that require no chemistry background. They are the sensory data that the body is already collecting. The only addition is the decision to take those data seriously. The story of Brazilian Blowout is a specific story. Specific company, specific product, specific chemical, specific regulatory failure. But it is also, in the way that specific stories often are, a story about something larger. About the gap between what is known and what is communicated. About the workers who bear the cost of that gap with their bodies. About a system that was designed a long time ago and has been adapting imperfectly to a world it was not designed for. It is also a story about women's labour. The beauty industry in the United States employs hundreds of thousands of workers, and the overwhelming majority of them are women. Cosmetologists, nail technicians, estheticians, salon assistants. This is a workforce that is gendered, that is disproportionately composed of immigrant women, that works in small business settings with limited institutional protection, and that handles chemical products in quantities and concentrations that would trigger extensive safety infrastructure in an industrial setting, but are largely invisible in a retail setting. This invisibility is not accidental. There is a long history of women's occupational exposures being dismissed or under-investigated. The early literature on occupational disease focused heavily on industries dominated by male workers: mining, manufacturing, construction, because those industries had the institutional organization, through unions and large corporate structures, that made occupational health studies possible. The industries dominated by female workers were more dispersed, less organized, harder to study, and less politically prominent. Cosmetologists are not the only group of female workers who have experienced this historical invisibility. Garment workers, domestic workers, agricultural workers, hospital housekeepers, each of these categories of predominantly female, often immigrant labour has its own history of delayed recognition of occupational chemical hazards. The pattern is consistent enough that it constitutes a feature of the occupational health system rather than a series of anomalies. Female workers in feminized industries are studied later, regulated later, and protected later than their counterparts in industries with more institutional power. Recognizing this pattern does not require assuming malice on the part of any individual regulator or researcher. It requires recognizing that attention is a resource, and resource allocation reflects power, and the workers who have had the most power to direct attention toward their own occupational health are not the workers who spend their days applying smoothing treatments in suburban salons. What has changed since the Brazilian Blowout controversy is that the beauty industry's occupational health has become more visible. Not fully visible. The nail salon worker's chemical exposure remains deeply understudied relative to her factory counterpart, but more visible than it was before. The controversy made it harder to claim, with a straight face, that salon products were entirely benign, or that the workers who used them daily were not exposed to chemicals that warranted scientific attention. That is a modest achievement, but it is a real one. The stories of the individual women who were exposed, the Renatas and the Lisas and the thousands of women who developed symptoms they could not name, who attributed their headaches to long days and their coughs to dry air, who made the correlation eventually or never made it at all. These stories belong to the history of the controversy in a way that the regulatory documents and the court records do not fully capture. The documents describe policies and findings and outcomes. The individual experiences describe what the gap between knowledge and worker protection looks like from the inside. What it looks like from the inside for the woman who has been breathing formaldehyde for 4 years without knowing it is ordinary. That is the hardest thing to understand from the outside. It looks ordinary because she learned to treat it as ordinary. The smell became the smell of work, the symptoms became the symptoms of a long career, the headache was just Tuesday. The extraordinary thing that was happening, chronic exposure to a known carcinogen at occupationally significant levels, was hidden inside the ordinariness of a working day. This is how most occupational illness works. It does not arrive dramatically. It accumulates in the background of lives that are otherwise occupied with everything else lives are occupied with. The stylist who develops occupational asthma does not develop it in a single day. She develops it over months or years of sensitization, through a process that is happening at a cellular level that she has no way to observe. By the time the diagnosis arrives, if it arrives, if she has access to a physician who asks the right occupational history questions, if the connection is made, the damage has already been done. The damage varies. Many of the women who are exposed to Brazilian Blowout during its peak years will not experience measurable harm from that specific exposure. The distribution of risk means that most people fall on the less affected end of the curve. But for the women at the more affected end, the women who are exposed at the highest concentrations, for the longest periods, with the most individual susceptibility, the harm is real, is documented in the medical literature, and occurred within a system that had the information it needed to prevent it and chose, through a combination of regulatory structure and commercial incentive not to act on that information in time. The word chose is imprecise here. Regulatory inaction is rarely a simple choice by identifiable individuals. It is the accumulated result of many smaller decisions made by many people within systems that structure what is prioritized, what is measured, what is acted on. The lobbyist who argued against expanded FDA authority was making a rational choice within her professional role. The FDA official who declined to pursue a market withdrawal rather than a warning letter was working within the tools and resources available to her. The salon owner who stocked Brazilian Blowout without reading the safety data sheet was following the industry norm. None of these decisions was obviously malicious. Together, they produced an outcome that harmed people who could not protect themselves because they did not have the information they needed. This is what regulatory failure looks like at the individual level. Not a villain, not a conspiracy, but a system with insufficient accountability at the points where its failures most affect the people with the least power to respond to them. The women who are harmed by Brazilian Blowout will carry those consequences into futures that the controversy has largely stopped thinking about. The news cycle moved on, the regulatory responses were implemented, the product was reformulated, the story, as stories do, concluded, at least as far as the coverage was concerned. The people whose bodies were part of the story did not conclude with it. They continued, carrying whatever they carried, making adjustments and compensations, defining themselves by everything else in their lives that was larger than the product they had used at work in 2009. This is the quiet end of occupational health stories, not a resolution but a continuation. The affected individuals are absorbed back into the general population, their specific experiences uncounted in any national database, their long-term health outcomes unmonitored by any system that connected them to their past exposure. They become ordinary people again, which is what they were all along, and their ordinariness means their stories are not tracked. What remains is the pattern. The pattern is available to anyone who looks for it. It was there before Brazilian Blowout, in the history of asbestos workers whose mesothelioma arrived decades after the asbestos, in the history of vinyl chloride workers whose angiosarcomas were attributed to everything but their work for years, in the history of every occupational chemical hazard that was known to researchers and regulators, before it was known to the workers it was injuring. The pattern is not hidden. It is in the literature, it is in the regulatory history. It is in the cases that have been adjudicated and the settlements that have been paid. What the pattern asks of anyone who looks at it is a kind of attentive patience, the willingness to hold the specific story and the larger structure in mind at the same time, to see both the woman in the chair and the regulatory framework that put her there without adequate protection, to resist the comfort of a villain who could be identified and punished, and to sit with the more difficult reality of a system that produces harm through distributed, ordinary, unremarkable choices. The afternoon light is long now, coming through the salon window at that angle it takes in early evening, when the day is not quite done but moving toward it. The products sit in their rows, the chairs are empty, the air has cleared, the day's chemical work has dissipated, taken by the ventilation or by the simple passage of time. In a few hours the salon will be locked, and the air inside will settle into whatever equilibrium it reaches overnight, and tomorrow the doors will open again. The reflection that the Brazilian Blowout story invites is not only a reflection on a specific product or a specific company, it is a reflection on the system that allowed the product to reach the market with a false safety claim, to remain in widespread use for years after concerns were raised, and to cause documented harm to workers who had every reason to trust the labels of the products they use professionally. Systems produce outcomes. The system produced this outcome. Understanding the system, how it is structured, what it incentivizes, what it is capable of and what it is not, is the beginning of understanding what would need to change to produce different outcomes. The people who work in salons are not an afterthought. They are the people who provide services that millions of Americans value and seek out regularly. They develop skilled crafts over years. They build relationships with clients that are sometimes among the most intimate non-family relationships in a person's life. The relationship with one's hairdresser has its own specific emotional texture, built on physical intimacy and trust and the particular vulnerability of allowing someone to change your appearance. The people who hold that trust deserve the same protection in their working environment that we extend, or aspire to extend, to workers in other industries. The gendered dimension of this story, that the workers most affected are overwhelmingly women, that the products most involved are products associated with women's beauty and femininity, that the industry regulating them has historically treated cosmetics as a lower priority than other product categories, is not incidental. It is structural. The underprotection of salon workers is connected to the underprotection of women's occupational health more broadly, to the historical tendency to treat women's work as less dangerous or less valuable than men's, to the political economy of an industry where the workforce has limited institutional power. Recognizing this does not require attributing malice to any individual. It requires recognizing that systems embed values and priorities, that the cosmetics regulatory system as designed in 1938 and updated imperfectly since reflects choices about whose safety was a priority and whose was secondary, and that changing the outcomes requires changing the underlying priorities. This is the work of advocacy, of legislation, of enforcement, of culture. Slow work, and work that has been ongoing for years, producing real improvements at a pace that is genuinely frustrating to anyone who knows what the improvements are coming from. The women who are harmed by Brazilian Blowout, the ones who developed respiratory symptoms, the ones who had to change careers, the ones who carry the effects of sensitization into their daily lives, are not statistics. They are specific people with specific lives and specific losses that no regulatory settlement has fully compensated and no clean beauty initiative has fully acknowledged. Their experiences are the human reality behind the regulatory history, and they are the reason why it matters whether the system works. The story does not end with the FDA warning letter, or the class action settlement, or the reformulated products on today's salon shelves. It continues in the bodies of the workers who are exposed, in the medical practices of the occupational health physicians who treat them, in the research that is being done on the long-term health outcomes of salon chemical exposure, in the advocacy that is still pushing for stronger cosmetic safety regulation, in the salons that are doing better and the ones that are not. It continues also in the choices being made right now in salons across the country about which products to stock and how to ventilate and whether to read the safety data sheet and whether to ask the distributor what the new formula contains. These choices accumulate. They constitute the practice of a field, and the practice of the field is where public health really happens, not in the regulatory office or the courtroom, but in the daily decisions of the people who work with the chemicals and the people who choose which chemicals are used. There is something quietly important about the way this story arrived in the public record through the ordinary process of workers noticing something, reporting it, and being taken seriously. The Portland Stylists who called Oregon OSHA were not scientists or advocates or regulatory experts. They were workers who had connected a pattern to a product and decided the connection was worth reporting. Their decision set in motion an investigation that produced findings that drove regulatory action that changed a product category. This is how public health systems are supposed to work, and the fact that it worked here, imperfectly, slowly, but ultimately, is worth acknowledging alongside everything that went wrong. The acknowledgement of what went wrong is more important, because what went wrong is the more durable condition. The 1938 Act is still the governing law. Pre-market safety testing is still not required for cosmetics. The formaldehyde-free claim, while more tightly regulated now than in 2009, could still appear on a product that releases formaldehyde in use if a company chose to make that argument and a regulatory response was slow to develop. The structural vulnerabilities that produced the Brazilian blowout problem have been patched in specific ways but not repaired at their foundations. What remains after the reflection is a kind of informed attention, the capacity to look at a salon product and understand something about what it contains and what that means, to know what questions to ask and why they matter, to see the regulatory landscape that surrounds the product and understand why it looks the way it does. This is not the same as solving the problem, but it is the condition for the kind of civic engagement that eventually changes problems this durable. The knowledge is in the air now. It can be breathed in deliberately and used. The specific history of how occupational health knowledge spreads through feminized industries is one that researchers in the field have been documenting with more intention since the 1990s. Before that, occupational health research was heavily weighted toward male-dominated industries, the mining diseases, the manufacturing diseases, the construction diseases, because those industries had more institutional organization, more union representation, and more political visibility than industries dominated by female workers. The shift towards studying women's occupational health more systematically has produced findings that are both specific and systemic. Specific: the elevated cancer rates among salon workers mentioned earlier, the PPD sensitization rates, the musculoskeletal disorders associated with prolonged standing and repetitive arm motions, the respiratory disease profiles that the Brazilian Blowout controversy brought to light. Systemic: the pattern of delayed recognition, inadequate regulation, and insufficient compensation that characterizes occupational illness in feminized industries across categories. Agricultural workers, domestic workers, garment workers, hospital housekeeping staff. Each of these predominantly female categories has its own history of occupational chemical exposure and its own history of delayed regulatory response. The herbicides and pesticides in farm fields, the cleaning chemicals in office buildings, the formaldehyde in textile treatments that workers in the garment industry encountered long before it became the subject of a beauty controversy. These histories are not separate from the Salon story. They are the same story, told in different settings, with different chemicals, and with the same structural features that keep the hazards invisible until someone starts measuring. The measurement, when it happens, changes what is knowable. This seems obvious, but is worth stating. You cannot know what you have not measured. Formaldehyde in salon air was a feature of salon workplaces from the moment Brazilian Blowout was introduced. It was not knowable as a feature of salon workplaces until someone brought monitoring equipment into a salon and measured it. The years between introduction and measurement, years during which the exposure was real and the knowledge did not exist, are the years that regulation cannot reach back to address. Future monitoring is the only thing that can prevent future gaps of this kind. Systematic workplace air quality monitoring, routine biological monitoring of workers in chemical-intensive industries, active surveillance for patterns of occupational illness. These are the tools that would provide early warning the next time a product with a false safety claim enters a market where workers are vulnerable. These tools exist. They are used in various industrial settings. They are not systematically deployed in the beauty industry. Building the infrastructure to deploy them more broadly is a specific, achievable policy goal with a clear benefit that can be estimated in reduced worker illness and reduced regulatory costs downstream. The cost of ignorance is not zero. It is paid in medical bills, in lost wages, in reduced occupational capacity, in the slower and more expensive regulatory processes that accompany the post-market discovery of hazards that pre-market testing would have identified earlier. The argument that regulation is too costly to require systematically must be weighed against the cost of the alternative, which is not no cost but a cost paid in a different currency by different people, typically the ones least equipped to bear it. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Come back now to where we began, the salon on a Tuesday in November. The windows fogged with the warmth of the blow dryers, Maria's hands working in practice sections, the plastic cap, the chemical note in the air, warm and flat and specific, the smell of something happening at a molecular level that no one in the room was thinking about. The afternoon is golden in the way late November afternoons are golden, the light thin and horizontal, touching the edges of things rather than illuminating them directly. The mirror shows you your own face, and the room behind you, and the steady movement of Maria's hands. It is an ordinary afternoon. It's a beautiful one, in its quiet way. Maria finishes. She removes the cap. She blows your hair dry with the competence of 11 years of practice, her hands working the brush through sections that are already beginning to reveal what the treatment has done. The hair lies flat against itself. The light catches it evenly. You look at yourself in the mirror and something that has always been at the back of your mind. The particular awareness of your hair, the monitoring of it, the morning calculation of what the weather will do to it, goes quiet. This is a real thing. This ease is real. The story around it is complicated, and the complications matter, and the women who bore the costs of those complications matter enormously. But the ease itself is also real, and the desire for it is real, and understanding why so many women walked into those salons and trusted what they were offered does not require ignoring what they were actually seeking. They were seeking to be comfortable in their own bodies, to be less at war with themselves on an ordinary morning, to close one of the small distances between who they were and who the world seemed to expect them to be. This is what beauty products have always promised, underneath all the marketing language. Not transformation exactly, but a kind of peace, an easing. The question that the Brazilian Blowout story leaves with us, quiet and specific, is not whether women should want smooth hair. It is whether the pursuit of that ease, that small daily peace, should have required exposure to a known carcinogen. Whether the stylist who provided it should have been breathing formaldehyde in concentrations that exceeded every occupational safety standard without being told. Whether the system tasked with preventing exactly this situation was designed in a way adequate to prevent it. The answer to those questions is not complicated. The path from here to a better answer is longer and more difficult than the answer itself, but knowing where the answer is, knowing it clearly, without alarm, with the particular calm of someone who has followed the story all the way to its end, is its own kind of orientation. You know what you're looking at now. You know what questions to ask. You know why they matter. Let the salon settle into evening. Let the light fade from the windows. Let the warmth of the blow dryers dissipate into the cool of the night coming. Maria has gone home. The clients have gone home. The products sit in their rows on the shelves, patient as chemistry, waiting for tomorrow. You're allowed to rest now. The story's not over. It continues in salons and regulatory offices and workers' compensation hearings and legislative chambers. But the telling of it, for tonight, is complete. Let it sit where it has settled, quiet and specific and real. The particular quality of a late evening in a salon has its own texture, distinct from the daytime. The mirrors no longer reflect movement. The chairs are stilled. The colour of the overhead lights, left on for a few minutes while someone locks up, is slightly warmer than daylight, slightly amber, and it makes the rows of products glow faintly on their shelves. The bottles are pretty. They have always been pretty. This is part of the design, the clean lines, the cheerful colours, the reassuring typography. Pretty things are trusted. Trust is a reasonable response to a world too complex to verify at every point. The stylist trusts the product the distributor sells her. The client trusts the stylist. The salon owner trusts the manufacturer. The manufacturer trusts the regulatory system to catch what it misses. The regulatory system is doing what it was designed to do, which is less than it could do if it were designed differently. No one in this chain is a fool. No one is necessarily a villain. The chain is simply imperfect, and the places where it is most imperfect are the places where the least powerful people stand. The breath comes in and goes out. The room is cooling now that the dryers are off. The sound of the street comes through the window that was closed all day. Ordinary city sounds, traffic and someone's radio. The sound of a world that has been carrying on outside while the salon conducted its business. You carry what you know now into the night. It is not heavy knowledge. It is specific and grounded and available for use when you need it. It will be there in the morning, behind your eyes, when you stand in front of a mirror and make the ordinary decisions that ordinary mornings require. It will be there when you sit in a chair and a pair of practiced hands begins to work. The breath comes in and goes out. The room is quiet. The knowledge is yours. The night is long and soft and there is nothing further required of you. Sleep comes in its own time, which is now, which is exactly now. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And here's a question I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever asked your stylist what's in a product before letting it be used on you, or does this story change whether you might? Leave it in the comments. I read everyone.